Hi, everyone, and welcome to this very important training. I'm going to ask that everyone just mute yourselves for the moment. You will be able to ask questions and participate in a few minutes, but just for now, if you can mute yourselves. My name is Leah Hill, and I am the Regional Autism Program Coordinator for DDS in the Northeast region. And I'd like to welcome you to this very important training on suicide prevention. We have the expertise with us here today from Riverside Trauma Center, and they are going to focus on providing successful strategies and practical ways to help you support the individuals that we serve here at DDS in the best possible way. And this session is also going to be recorded. So this session, which is part 1, as well as part 2, which is going to take place on the 20th, also from 1 to 4 p.m. Hopefully you've registered for that as well separately. Both sessions are going to be recorded and posted, available on ddslearning.com. And that way it'll be available for everyone, and you can share it with providers and other staff who were not able to attend today's session. I also wanted to let you know that Dr. Berkowitz, who is here leading the training today, will be sharing slides on the screen, but those slides will also be available after the training, and they will be posted on DDS Learning as well. And like I said, you will have opportunities throughout this training to unmute yourself and ask questions. You will also be able to use the chat box to type your questions if you need to, and we will monitor those questions. So you can do that, and then you can also use the reaction button if there's something that you like hearing, that you want to put a smile face or an applause. Please feel free to do that as well. So what I'd like to do now is have my counterparts throughout the state introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria Stefano, Autism Program Coordinator for DDS Metro Region.
Thanks. And how about Shannon?
Hello, my name is Shannon Hubley, and I am the Autism Program Coordinator for the Southeast region.
And Pamela.
Hi, I'm Pamela Ferguson, and I'm the Regional Autism Program Coordinator for the Central West region. Welcome.
Thanks, Pamela. And I love your reindeer ears. Those are great. And your antlers. That looks adorable. Really great today. So I just wanted to point out before I pass it along for the training is that this came about really because of the feedback from the autism service coordinators and the area offices throughout the state. We have noticed over the last few years, and especially over the last year since the pandemic, that the suicidal ideation has increased, or it seems to have increased, and we're hearing about that in our ASD only population. So even though this training is really for everyone, that the focus will be on the ASD only population, but there's a lot here that you can learn from, you know, for everyone, and to help all of the individuals that we support and we serve. So this training came from what we say in the field, where people were asking for help, asking for strategies and practical ways to support individuals. And it's also been made possible through the 509 union. So we want to say thank you to the 509 union for making this possible as well. So with that, I think all the notes we've got out of the way, I'd like to hand it over to our presenter today, Dr. Larry Berkowitz.
Great. Thanks so much, Leah. And thanks to all of you at DDS for the invitation to be here and to talk about an important topic. So I'm also joined in the audience today by Rebecca Ames, who's a senior clinical manager at Riverside Trauma Center, who helped put together this training and is often co-presents with me. So she may be offering some color commentary and jumping in from time to time as well. And we'll definitely be here the next time. Great. So I'm going to pull up some slides. Okay. I was telling our hosts that I'm new to presenting on Teams, so bear with me a moment, please. Great. There's just so many new platforms, right, that we're all learning, and all the new technology that we're trying to get comfortable with. Although, as I was saying to Valerie a moment ago, that it seems inevitably there's some little technology snafu or something, right? Great. So a couple of the logistics are, our hope and our plan is to provide you with a really wide range of information, which we'll tell you a little bit more about in just moments. But the plan is for us to meet for 3 hours today. We'll take a break somewhere in the middle of the day, and come back again next time. So it's cumulative, the material builds. If we were in person, I wish we were, I'd get to ask you to turn your cell phones to silent or stun or something. But the equivalent here is, as you heard Leah ask, just be sure that when you're not speaking, please keep your microphone on mute. Just so you know, we're going to cover a lot of material in our time together, but the focus of our time is really on understanding suicide, understanding the implications, understanding our own reactions, risk and protective, a whole range of things. We're not really going to get into treatment, though, because that's really beyond the purview of what we can do in a few hours together. We'd need a couple of weeks to really do that, although we will provide some general ideas on what's best practice and what's the evidence base tell us about treatment around suicidality. Now, in terms of self-care, I really want to acknowledge that we're about to launch into and spend a lot of time talking about suicide. And that can be tough. We want to acknowledge that lots of us have been impacted in our own lives, whether that's professionally or personally, in our families or our social networks have been impacted by suicide. And I really just want to mostly state that and to acknowledge that and invite you to really pay attention to taking care of yourself and your needs as we're talking about this topic. If at any point you find the conversation's feeling a little difficult, please take a few minutes to yourself, take a break. And feel free to, I'll provide my email address afterwards. Feel free to connect with me or any of your colleagues if you find in any way the material feels a little too activating. A number of objectives here. I'm not going to read them all to you, but the idea is to really help you understand the scope of the issue, to get into some issues around language and understanding, talk about risk and protective factors. We're going to get into the next time we get together talking about safety planning and what that is and what that looks like, just so you can have an additional tool in your tool belt, if you will, about how to deal with suicide and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And probably one of the most important pieces that we're going to focus on in the presentation is really understanding and trying to have some empathy for just why is it? What is that thought about suicide about? What purpose is it serving for people? So you can expect us to go into all that. And for those of you who are more visual learners, this is just a different way of representing some of that material. The idea is that still trying to understand, and suicide is about, it still really comes down to clinical judgment. I wish we had some rubric where we could say, if a person is demonstrating 3 of these things and answers, yes to 4 of these items, and then they're at 80% likelihood of, we just don't have that, right? We don't have that yet. The field has a long way to go. It still comes down to our clinical judgment and understanding somebody's risk. But we do know what the pieces of the puzzle are that have to be put together to arrive at that assessment, to arrive at that understanding. And that's what we'll be really addressing today. And the way we do that is we break this into modules that for the understanding of suicide, to get at the risk and protective factors, for example, managing our reactions. Putting all that together is going to help us with understanding risk and being able to describe it somewhat. And then we'll get into some issues like safety planning, quick overview of treatment, and finally, and most importantly, some conversation about self-care. I know we talk about that a lot in our fields. I don't know if you would agree with this. My experience is that we're all really good at teaching people about self-care. Maybe not so good about doing it ourselves, but we really, really feel that in order to do this work well, that we're all doing, it's an ethical imperative that we really understand how we best take care of ourselves. So, maybe I could even ask now before we jump in to the first module, are there any specific things that you hope to learn or take away from our time together this time and next time? And Leah and the others, unfortunately, since I actually can't see the screen to see any chat, it would be helpful if people type in for you to let me know, but please do feel free to unmute yourselves as well.
Okay, yes, we will monitor the chat as well.
Thanks. So any things you're hoping to, in particular from the training?
Hi, Larry. My name's Amanda, and I worked for our local crisis center when I was doing my graduate program. And I guess what I was curious about was really distinctions of how to intervene on a crisis level with autism only, as opposed to the general public or someone that has maybe comorbid with autism and a mental health diagnosis such as bipolar. What tools or techniques to actually be effective in communicating with them when they are in crisis, and just kind of how that looks different than mainstream interventions.
Great, Amanda. Thank you for that. Really important question. And what I would say to you is that my approach generally is to try to help folks really understand the basics about suicide. And you're the experts in understanding how best to communicate with people who have autism. And I certainly have some thoughts about that. And there's been some new, in the last couple of years, some attention finally in the suicide prevention community to the specifics about autism spectrum disorders. The American Association of Suicidology has about a year ago published some material that's on their website about it. So that's starting to emerge. There's not a lot of specifics there. So my hope would be that would be the conversation we can have together about thinking, how do we apply these concepts, I think, as you're saying, specifically to folks who are dealing with autism. But thank you for that, Amanda. Other thoughts, questions? And I'll definitely try to keep that in mind, Amanda.
Hi, someone was asking for a list of things of what not to do.
Okay, we'll have a couple of those. We will have a couple of those in there as we start talking about how do you ask about suicide. So great to know. I'll jot that down, what not to do. Okay.
I just wanted to add to that last question that I think it would be great as we go to just invite your general participation in that conversation. If we're saying something, it can absolutely be a group conversation around how would this sound if we were talking to somebody with ASD, and well, it might sound more like this. And I think together we can collaboratively make some progress in that, if that makes sense. I think I would really invite all of you to help create that conversation. I think we have a lot to learn that way.
Thanks for that, Rebecca.
Rebecca, Larry, this is Becky. Just one more from the chat. One a living objective from Jennifer Durant. And she asked the question, do the different ways in which the autistic brain works compromises or distorts their understanding of the potential finality of the act? And also to Michelle Kaplan-Vigil, also shared that she's hoping to learn some strategies for how to respond supportively when an individual brings up suicide or suicidal ideations, even though it might not be within her clinical purview.
Yep. Yeah. Two great and important questions. Yes, hopefully that will be one of the takeaways from today. How do we talk compassionately and carefully with people who might be bringing up suicide? Absolutely. And in terms of the issue of distortion and understanding, that's always a challenge, right? How much does a person understand? That even goes to, we've done this training with a number of folks who work for the Department of Children and Families. They work often with young kids, and we hear young kids talking about suicide too. Do they cognitively have the capacity to fully understand the finality of death? That's an important question. We don't always know that. So some of that is sort of your assessment of that with a person and understanding the best, your understanding of that is with a person. And sometimes it gets into the conversation with them. And that may be part of the conversation that we have to have with someone who doesn't cognitively fully understand the finality of death, right? Is trying to help drive at that a little bit and help them get that and understand exactly what the implications of the behaviors would be, what would be the consequences that they wouldn't, see people get. But this is important, and we'll definitely try to get to that. Hey, I'd like to ask a question here too, and I know this is a question that probably could take an hour of conversation, but if we could just do the, I would like to hear your reaction to language, and because we talk, language matters, words matter, and we'll talk about that related to suicide in just a few minutes. But I have heard differing and been in different conversations with different people in the autism community, and have heard, my preference has always been to use person first language. And I would say, typically someone with a bipolar disorder, someone who has autism. And yet I've heard any number of people with autism saying that they prefer to be referred to as autistic because that's who they are. And it's not a syndrome or disability in their mindset. And I'm just curious about what folks here feel is most comfortable in terms of languaging. I know this is probably a huge philosophical question, but I would just be interested in one or two opinions on that.
All right, this is Victor Drubert. I'm an autism service coordinator out of the Merrimack Valley office. I would say, again, we serve a large number of folks, as folks may know, as autism service coordinators. And it's difficult. I would say in terms of age and for me, I have the most comfortable conversations with folks. I don't want to restrict it to age, but the folks, I would say 27 to 34, 35, where, life and experience has taken over. And some of those conversations are just kind of natural, where they've been able to identify with me as their service coordinator. They are comfortable, as we're sitting through a life plan meeting, which is kind of what we do now for our yearly. But in those meetings, folks, essentially, talking about their autism diagnosis and essentially knowing, and for me as service coordinator, it's nice and kind of refreshing to be able to hear the individual express that in such an important meeting. That's just, I guess, a small sample size, but as an autism service coordinator, and someone touched on it earlier, is around just, us being even here on this call, for me, is huge. It just automatically, for me, just makes things feel more supportive. So, it was Rebecca who spoke on it earlier. So, for me, I know that's long-winded, but that's kind of just,
Thank you.
Autism service coordinator, I definitely want to be able to touch on some things, so.
Victor, thank you. I'm glad you raised that, and look forward to having you join in the conversation. Thank you. Any other thoughts on language before we jump in?
There were a few things in the chat. Did you want me to read
Sure.
those for you? Okay, so we got that one. So Judy Doherty said, some of this is an age thing. I was also taught person first language, and I find it hard to define someone with a diagnosis, but I am sensitive to the individual's opinions. Felicia Spies, sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. It's an ongoing conversation within the autism community. Absolutely. Most autism self-advocates prefer autistic versus with autism. Person first language was developed by non-disabled professionals, and the autism community is encouraging people to shift their thinking to identify first language. For example, I am a white person. I am not a person with whiteness. That's an interesting.
I love that.
I know, I like that.
Yeah.
And Leilani said, I am a transition service coordinator working with 18 to 22-year-olds, 18 to 22. Over 30% fall under autism only, which in our language means autism without intellectual disability. In speaking with individuals that I work with who are autistic, the preference is I am autistic. In my personal life, my brother identifies as autistic, and so does my son. And those are the chats.
Thank you. This is very helpful. I will try to be mindful of that, and forgive me if I go back and forth and use the terms interchangeably, but this is really helpful for me to hear, because I've had this conversation any number of times with people, and I do, I love the analogy there. We don't describe ourselves as having whiteness, but great. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's jump into this first module, which is about understanding suicide. The goal in the first couple of modules are really to help you quickly become suicidologists, right? To have some of the basic understanding of sort of the lay of the land, the demographics, the understandings of some of the theories around what is suicidality about. And one of the ways that we like to start now, speaking to people who are part of the community, is to invite someone to share with you their thoughts, somebody who is someone with a lived experience of having lived with suicidal thoughts and having survived a suicide attempt. About, oh gosh, I'd say it's probably 14 years ago, 12, 14 years ago. I went to a general meeting of the Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention. And at the beginning of the meeting, we'll all go around the room introducing ourselves, and people are introducing themselves as I say I'm a psychologist. People will say they're suicide loss survivors, teachers, service coordinators. And this young man who was there introduced himself, Craig Miller, said he's a suicide attempt survivor. And he's doing well now, but when he was an adolescent, he had survived a suicide attempt or two and been hospitalized several times. And he was doing well now and wanted to give back to the community. Craig has written an amazing book called This Is How It Feels. It's just beautifully written, talking about his experiences. He's become a national and international speaker on suicide prevention and sharing some of his own thoughts and experiences. And so we asked him, we said, your perspective is so valuable. Because when you get down to when you think about it, who knows best what's going to be helpful, what it's like, than someone who's been there, right? Who's lived it. And so Craig agreed to be interviewed by us so we could share his experiences with you as we do our training. So I want to start there with what is it he has to share with us. So please be listening, especially for some things like when did this start? What did it serve for him? What was it he wanted? And anything else that stands out for you. But it's a couple of minutes, and let's hear what he has to say.
I had this very real, vivid memory still, but a very real moment of what it would feel like. Just put everything, not have to. Look, there's that part of you, the part that we're all born with, that's just not right. I had that in me where I was not supposed to be like this, and knowing that.
Larry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. This is Becky. Yeah. It's very hard to hear the audio. So I know you turned the volume up on your media player. I'm wondering if you might also want to turn the volume up on your computer overall. Oh, you're muted now.
All the way to 100. Are you all able to turn up your volumes at all to help? Or? Anybody else have any thoughts?
I do not.
We'll just have to listen real close.
Yep.
All right. Apologies. I'm not sure what it is about
Might
this.
want to restart it, Larry. Maybe we can try just back it up and.
Yeah. All right. Right. Just have to.
Excuse me, Larry. This is Dr. V. At the top where it says audio and video, do you have a spot there that says or view sharing multimedia? Sometimes that helps to change the way we're able to see your screen.
Yeah, unfortunately, all I can see is the slide. I've got some
okay.
stuff
So
at the bottom. Let me take a quick look at that.
Yeah.
See what those are. Yeah.
On your share button, do you have share multimedia?
So let me stop sharing and then I'll take a look at that again.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. You know how this is in this remote world, right? We're all here and just hanging out, having a good time, waiting to catch up again.
Yeah, let me go back a slide or two. Let's try to start it over and see what happens. Share, optimize for text and images. Optimized for motion and video. I could try that.
Yes, why don't you try that, sir? Let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens there. Let's try it again.
I was washing a big chef's knife, and I held it up to my desk, back down, and started crying. Slid down, and I had this very real, vivid memory still, but a very real moment of what it would feel like to just put everything, not have to do it. But there's that part of you, part that we're all born with, that's just not right. I had that in me where it's not supposed to be right. And knowing that the thoughts of suicide I was having, how real they were, and what it was like to not want to live, that was sort of opened my eyes to my life in general to say, this isn't how it's supposed to be. You know, supposed to be normalcy somewhere. So that sort of gave me some hope to carry. The thought of suicide when I was never really left my head ever. In fact, I used it as an option. To me, it became a way of having an escape plan. I had very little support. I looked at it as, you know what, I'll fix tomorrow, I'll get to tomorrow, and if it's really that bad, I have a way out. I use that every day to continue to when I was first introduced to help deal with clinicians and therapists, the first person I met was a guy who was probably in his 60s, and to his credit, probably had seen it all, been there, done that, very comfortable with this is what it is, and that's it, and let's go. And I sat in his office with my mother, this 15-year-old kid, scared to death, now learning that I have a mental illness. I'm in a psychiatrist's office. And he just kind of leaned back, and you have OCD, probably a growth spurts, chemical imbalance, and we signed an afternoon for that. Real cold, hard, run-of-the-mill, next patient please kind of a guy. And that was it. That was my introduction to it. And talk about being scared and then being more scared. I mean, it really just completely set up on the wrong foot. And then I was assigned to see a counselor. And that counselor, again, sort of, he had just gotten done with a patient, and then comes the next one, and here I am, this kid, 15 years old. I don't want to talk because I don't know what to say. I don't even know what to do. And he had me focus on breathing if I was angry. So part of me understood, well, you have to address what's happening now, but it never went beyond that. Breathing techniques, and he actually gave me an elastic band to put them on my wrist to snap when I was in a compulsive moment to sort of snap me out of it, I guess it was before. But you think about that, especially now, he gave an elastic band to snap to a kid who's 95% of the time is spent on obsession or compulsion. And I would sit there and get stuck on snapping myself for hours. I mean, it set out in a way where I had to feel a certain amount of pain for it to count as the right number. So I would have to do it 482 times or something. If it didn't hurt, well, that wouldn't count. And then maybe I'd have to start over. It was bad, not very well thought out. But that was my introduction to mental health. This guy that's just, you're you're number 21 patient. Here you go. This is your prescription. You'll be fine. Learn how to breathe right. You're talking to a guy who spent 6 years, a teenage kid who was 6 years of his life assaulted, bullied for it, no support. My mother's an alcoholic. My father's not around. I don't even know what the world is about, or I don't know what's going on with me. Tell me to breathe. I was hospitalized through my teenage. I was hospitalized. After the first time, I got to the point where I knew that I was pretty bad. Sitting with someone.
Larry, I think we've officially lost the audio with Craig. So I know you've seen this video hundreds of times. I'm hoping that you might be able to just summarize what he spoke about. You're also muted. Oh, Larry, you're muted. We can't hear you. I'm so sorry.
I'll jump in while Larry's working on his audio. So there's a few main themes that we really hear, and I wish you could really hear Craig in his own words. If we can get it sorted by next time, we can replay it. So there's a couple of really important points. One is, as Larry mentioned before the video, Craig starts thinking about suicide as early as age 8. And so one of the things that we start to look at when we're looking at suicide prevention in adolescence and young adulthood, and later on with the age group that you're working with, is can we start to see the signs earlier, treat things earlier, catch things earlier? What are these warning signs? A main point from this video that we're going to get to quite a lot later today is this idea of suicidal ideation as a coping mechanism. So what Craig talks about there is there were days in which what got him through the day was knowing he could always take his own life the following day. And that became a coping strategy. We might call it not the healthiest coping strategy. We might work with people to try to develop more preferable coping strategies and more sustainable coping strategies. But it's a coping strategy. And as we start to become suicidologists together today and next week, we really want to develop this empathy for the suicidal wish in understanding that starting point, that we want to align with somebody. We want to get on that same page and understand where they're coming from. And so it was a strength for him. It was a way he survived, was knowing that he could die, if that makes sense. Again, he says it rather poignantly. And then another main point that really comes through there is really what his early experiences were with the healthcare system. Really jaw-droppingly horrific. And that he just felt like another number. Next patient, that doctors and medical providers and therapists weren't understanding him, where he was coming from, or really what his struggles were. And he talked about being a young adult with severe OCD and being told to just snap a rubber band against his wrist when he's feeling suicidal. Well, that turned into its own compulsion around how many times he had to snap the rubber band. And I think the point is really made that we've come a long way, thank goodness, but we have a long way to go in terms of being providers who can sit down, be present, and most importantly, listen to where a patient, an individual, a client is coming from, so that we can take our own kind of predisposition out of the equation and really align with an individual and be empathetic and fully present with them in order to partner with them and make progress and move away from that suicidal ideation. Larry, how did I do? Was that a pretty good synopsis?
Thank you, Rebecca. We are going to replace the video with a video of you saying all that. This is being recorded anyway, so That was great. Yeah. I mean, really, to summarize, I think what Craig was really telling us is he just wanted someone to listen to him. He wanted to be able to tell his story of what was going on in his life and have someone really listen with some compassion. And he wasn't getting that. He wasn't getting that, right? But also, I just want to reinforce that point, Rebecca, you just made so well. He really lets us know that, and to me, this is one of the greatest understandings we can have, that for most people who are thinking about suicide, it becomes a coping strategy for them. And yeah, you stated it well, not a very healthy one, right? But just like substance use or, non-suicidal self-injury, cutting or something, same way that those things become a coping strategy for people. So that's important to bear in mind. So any thoughts or reactions to any of that, or any little bits you may have been able to hear? I'm so sorry again. We'll have to problem solve this one.
Hi, Larry. This is Valerie again. I put in the chat before. If you're interested and able to, we're happy to share the link on the DDS Learning website as well with the presentation, so people can view that if that's something you care to do. I just want to put that out there.
Okay. We'll see if there's a way we can figure that out. Yep.
No problem.
Becky, can I ask you to jot a note about that? Thanks.
I do have a question. And is it something to help a person try to discern whether or not that is a coping strategy for them, or whether it is actually something that they think they might follow through with, and helping somebody be aware of where that line might be crossed? And that, I guess that's more of how it gets into treatment, or is that a...
Yeah, no. I love the question, Maria. And I think, you'll hear us build into that exactly. It has to do with the way in which we talk to people. I think we have to acknowledge that we get that it's a coping strategy, and that we think our job, and we know our job, is that we can help folks figure out other ways of coping, that they don't necessarily need to they don't need this one. I wouldn't necessarily struggle. I'm jumping ahead here, but I wouldn't necessarily struggle to try to take it away from someone, because if they truly feel this is the only thing they got, it's the only thing that's keeping them going, then I'm not going to try to take it away. But, well, in saying that, I'm not endorsing suicide, but I'm acknowledging the purpose it's serving for someone. So, but yeah, my job is to help you build and learn and recognize that there are lots of other ways of coping.
And I'd just like to add one more thing to that as well. And even while I'm asking this makes me very uncomfortable to have that conversation with someone, because I'm not a clinician. And am I supposed to have this conversation with someone, or is that left for the clinicians who specialize in this? So I think, as you were asking before, that I think that might be helpful at some point with sessions to address.
Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. We will get to that. So let me jump back and try to get the screen back up, some slides back up, and we'll move along. All right. Getting into some of the demographics of understanding suicide. Certainly, it's a major national public health issue. 2020, the last year for which we have data, which just came out a few weeks ago, there were 45,800 suicide deaths in the US. Interestingly, that number has actually been trending down the last 2 years after decades of going up. So it was down about 3% from 2019. 2019 was down 2% from 2018. Sure as heck hope it continues in this direction. We'll see. Had been the 10th leading cause of death across the United States. We'll see where the data from COVID comes in on that. And now here's an interesting and debatable statistic that is often put out there, which is that some people say that up to 90% of people who die by suicide have some underlying mental health issue, some mental health challenge going on as well. There are different studies. Some say about 50% or more, some say up to 90%. But the point of this and knowing this is that if we can help people both articulate what's going on for them, that they're struggling with something, they're feeling depressed, they're feeling anxious, if we can help them figure out how to label that and let us know, or if we can recognize it in others, as is part of your work, right? And often in working with families and other care providers, to figure out if there is some kind of mental health challenge going on, then we might be, if we can deal with that and treat a mental health challenge, which is often treatable, then we can decrease one of the risk factors, which is an important point. When I say one of the risk factors, it's really important to remember there's never a single cause for suicide. It is always a perfect storm, if you will, of things coming together for people. And in fact, it's kind of a dangerous narrative just to stick with a single cause. So, you know, you've seen the headlines over the years. Somebody was bullied and killed themselves. Somebody breaks up in a relationship, loses their job, gets arrested, and dies of suicide. You know, the narrative there, unfortunately, then is for other people who may be getting bullied or something's like, oh, people who get bullied kill themselves. We need to be clear with people that it is complex, that there are a lot of things that come together. Maybe we see the tipping point that may move someone from thinking about it to acting on it, but it's always some combination of other vulnerabilities, factors that are coming together. Here in Massachusetts, it's certainly a major public health issue. 615 deaths in 2020. That's preliminary data, has yet to be firmed up by DPH, but which is also down from the year before. We've been, as I was saying, even in Massachusetts, we were seeing suicide rates increasing over the last decade. And interestingly, Massachusetts has one of the lowest suicide rates in the nation. If you look at it year to year, it bounces around, and different data sets will show sometimes Massachusetts, New Jersey, DC, New York, Maryland all have very low rates. Any thoughts about why Massachusetts might have a particularly low rate? Please feel free to unmute if you have a thought on that. Or type it in the comments.
I would assume it's from, I mean, the governor was very passionate about backing some mental health supports within the state. So I would assume that would be a piece of that.
Massachusetts, yeah, the state government has been very supportive. We've, for many years, spent more per capita on suicide prevention than any other state. I understand there are a couple other states that are kind of rivaling with us now for that honor, but we have. So Massachusetts, the current fiscal year, we're spending $7 million a year on suicide prevention, which is, you know, for this, our state is quite good. So yeah, a commitment by the state, absolutely one potential factor. Other thoughts about it?
Could it be something to do, I'm not entirely sure what the numbers show, but is it related to gun control, the accessibility of being able to have a gun?
Yes, I think that is a significant contributing factor. Massachusetts has one of the lowest gun ownership rates in the country, and we have some of the strictest gun safety laws. About, gosh, maybe 6 years ago now, there was a whole very comprehensive set of gun safety laws enacted in Massachusetts, which included things like some requirements for educators to be trained in suicide, understanding suicide and suicide prevention, for things like I think the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number is now printed on all firearm ID cards that people get, to be licensed to carry. So there's been a lot of efforts in that. And we do know, if you look nationally at the states that have the highest suicide rates, they also have the highest gun ownership rates. So, and I truly don't say this as a political issue, but if you look, firearms are the leading cause. Just over half of all suicide deaths are by firearms. And in fact, among all firearm deaths, two-thirds of firearm deaths are suicide deaths. So it's, if someone is thinking about suicide and makes an attempt with a firearm, it's almost guaranteed to be lethal, right? So in a state where we don't have much access and people are more attuned to safety issues, that is absolutely a preventative factor. In Massachusetts, firearms is not a leading cause of suicide death. So I think that is it too. People have often speculated too, maybe access to services. And it's true in more urban areas. We see lower rates in general than more rural areas, and that often seems to go along with access to services. It's interesting. You and I would probably all agree that we just don't have enough services here in Massachusetts, mental health, other, social services. But compared to the rest of the country, a lot of our, friends and colleagues in other states look at what we have here with some envy. So it's all relative, I guess. But I do think the firearms issue is a huge one. When we look at suicide rates by gender, We see, and so far the data is just binary, males and females. We don't have breakouts from mortality records that would tell us about people who identify as transgender or non-binary. But you can see that lighter color there, that lighter blue is males, the darker color is females. So who dies more often is suicide, males or females? Right, it's males, as you can see, on the order of about 3 or 4 to 1. Although we know that women attempt more often on about the same order, 3 to 4 times, more often than men do, and are more likely to survive their attempts. Any thoughts about why it might be that men might die more often of suicide?
More violent means.
Absolutely. They tend to choose more violent, more lethal means, like firearms. Yep, exactly. In terms of suicide rates by age, what age group would you think has the highest suicide rates? Please feel free to jump in. What age?
30-year-olds, maybe?
I'm sorry, say again?
20 to 30-year-old range.
20 to 30-year-old. Okay, great. Any other thoughts or guesses?
I would say between the ages of 21 to 24.
21, 24, very specific range there. Okay, so early 20s, great.
We also have some thoughts in the chat, Larry. Felicia says ages 40 to 60. Allison thinks ages 21 to 50. And Hector is thinking ages 35 to 50. So it sounds like we're all over the map.
We're all over the map. It's interesting because none of you said adolescents. Usually people say, oh, teenagers. And I think the reason people say that is because that gets a lot of attention in the media, as it should. Anytime a young person dies, it's tragic. Of course, anyone dying of suicide is tragic. But yeah, it actually ends up being middle-aged working white males have the highest suicide rates. And you can see it just climbing right up and coming back down. Interestingly, nationally, this is Massachusetts, nationally, you see it go back up again in the 80s. Again. Now, by the way, I just want to say, I think middle age really should go to about 70 or 75 now, but just saying. No, it is that sort of working age range, that middle 35 to 55 or so tends to, or well, here we see it up to 64 has the highest rates. So now that's interesting. It depends on a whole bunch of factors too, perhaps in different communities or different cultural and racial groups that differs. And speaking of ethnicities and ethnic groups, we see in general, white, non-Hispanic folks have the highest rates of suicide. When we say rate, we're talking number per 100,000. And that's the way you can compare different rates, outside of sheer numbers, right? So you can see just looking at this graph that white folks have the highest rates in general, as compared to other groups like Hispanic, Black, non-Hispanics, Asian Americans. And you can see all those other groups all are sort of clustering close to each other right now. If we were looking, I think there may be a slide about adolescents too, though. That's where we see Native Americans having absolutely the highest in the younger age groups. And it breaks out differentially. When I say, so if you disaggregate the data, so right now I was saying middle-aged white folks seem to have the highest rates. If we're looking at the Black community, that tends to be 20s and 30s. So it skews a little younger. We also know that sadly, even young children know about suicide, right? So young kids talk about it. Brian Mshira, who's a psychologist and a researcher at the University of Quebec in Montreal, has talked to kids in elementary schools and asked them about suicide. By third grade, all of them understand the word and know what it means. In first grade, one kid that he talked to knew what the term suicide was, but many of them knew what it meant to kill yourself. And I think this gets to that question you'd asked earlier about the cognitive capability and what do people understand. Sadly, some of the work we do at Riverside Trauma Center is helping support schools, workplaces, communities after there's been suicide deaths. Something we call postvention. After there's been a suicide death, how do you support? And sadly, we've been in a number of schools where elementary school kids have died by suicide. Numbers are still very small, but it is an age group where we're seeing increases. And the truth is there, people will say, well, was that a suicide or was it an accident? Sometimes families are saying it's an accident. And frankly, I think it's both for people who don't have the cognitive capability to really fully understand the implications of their actions, so that, for the third grader who dies by suicide, technically, by definition, they took an action which ended up taking their life. So yes, that's a suicide death. But in terms of their cognitive capability, that's got to be, in some ways, it's an accident too, because they just don't fully understand it. And that is something that might apply to some of the folks that you're working with, right? Interesting bit of research comes from a national survey that happens annually. It's the National Survey of Drug Use and Health Indicators. This data is gathered by phone calls to households in all 50 states and Puerto Rico, and they ask a whole bunch of questions about substance use, alcohol, all kinds of things. And there are a number of questions about mental health and about suicide. Most of this is about questions of adults. They don't ask younger people. But when they extrapolate out the data, asking people, have you thought about suicide in the past year? Over 12 million people a year in the US would say they've thought about suicide. Now, I don't know about you, but that to me is a stunning number. That just seems huge, right? And it says a number of things to me. One of which is, if we can help identify when people are thinking about it, we might be able to get in and intervene quickly, right? Before things progress for them to planning and attempts. You can see that, of all ages, you heard me say just earlier, about 45,000 people died of suicide in 2020. So clearly not everyone who thinks about suicide acts on those thoughts, right? About 1.2 million made attempts. So clearly not as many do. And fortunately, nowhere near 12 million people, thank gosh, die of suicide. It also is it tells me something else, which is often when people are thinking about suicide, they feel shame, they feel stigma, they don't want to share it, they worry that people will think they're crazy or weak or something. But if it comes up, one of the things we can often do is normalize it. We know that literally millions of people in the country tell us they've thought about suicide. Again, I'm not condoning it or endorsing it, but I'm just helping normalize for people, which might then make it easier for somebody we're talking to or working with to feel more comfortable talking about it, right? So that's about some statistics, some numbers. I started off by talking with you about language, right? And we know words matter. Language is important. It conveys a lot. So a little bit about some of the current thinking on the language we use. Let me ask you your thoughts. Is suicide a crime or a sin? Any thoughts on that? And again, feel free to type that in or just say something if you'd like. Well, those terms, come from times when suicide was seen as a crime or a sin. And it has led us to using a term that we all use just without probably even thinking about it. It's common usage to say that somebody has committed suicide, right? And that's the origin of that term, committed suicide, from when it was seen as a crime or a sin. We don't talk about any other death that way, do we? We wouldn't say someone committed a heart attack or committed cancer, right? And so we're actually trying in the field to move away from using the term committed suicide because it conveys something. It conveys a message that we still think of suicide as a sin or a crime. And there are many countries in the world and probably some jurisdictions in the US where it's still on the books as a crime. The Catholic Church once thought of it as a mortal sin. It's no longer seen that way. And, and it had implications for somebody whose family member died of suicide. They couldn't even bury their family member in the church cemetery before. That's changed. So instead of saying committed suicide, what do we ask? We're encouraging people to just say that somebody's died of suicide. They took their own life. They killed themselves, and talk about it just very kind of in a frank description about it, rather than using the term committed. Now, a couple other words that have also been part of common usage. I mean, how many of you have heard somebody say that someone made a failed attempt or a successful attempt? Well, let's think about the meanings of those words, right? What would be a successful attempt? That means they died? To me, a successful attempt is if somebody made an attempt and they survived it. That's the success, that they survived. And, on the flip side of that coin, imagine somebody who's actually made an attempt, wakes up in the hospital and hears that because they've survived, and hears that they've had a failed attempt. What's the message there? I mean, it's probably something along the lines of, I'm such a screw up, I can't even do that right. So again, we try to avoid failed or successful attempt and just talk about that somebody has survived a suicide attempt, or they died after an attempt. Right? And there's this other term too, which gets used a lot, gets thrown around a lot, a suicidal gesture. And the problem with that is not necessarily that it conveys meaning. Sometimes people use it in a sort of judgmental way, like, oh, they didn't really mean it. Or some people will say that they take the term literally, like they gestured, like that they might do something, that they made their fingers into a gun or something else like that. Some people, when we ask the question, some people say, oh, they think gesture means that somebody made a low lethality attempt. Or so. The problem is it's very vague. No one really knows the meaning of the word. So if you ever hear that, if a family member or a service provider says that someone you're working with made a gesture, a suicide gesture, just ask them, could you describe what happened? So that you really know. If it's in a record or something, try to find out more. Saying that someone made a gesture doesn't convey much to us because it's just too vague, right? And that's what this is. We want to make sure we have shared language so that we understand what we're talking about, and that when we're communicating, either in research or in practice, or talking about things, that we want to make sure that we're understanding each other. So a couple of basic definitions.
Obvious. Oh, I'm sorry. Can we ask one question first? I'm sorry.
Please.
Before you
Please,
go into.
please.
Sorry, I'm just going to read from the chat.
Yeah.
Someone posted, curious if someone attempts suicide and fails, are they more or less likely to try it again in the future? Are there any effects from a failed suicide? Great. And so remember, we'll use the term that they survived an attempt. So they're a survivor, right? And so here's the thing. That's a great question. Over 90% of people, about 90 or a little more than 90% of people who survive a suicide attempt do not go on to die by suicide. And that's really important to keep in mind. And that really counters a narrative that's out there often, which is if someone really wants to kill themselves, they're really going to do it. True, maybe for a small percentage of people. For some people, it's interesting because it depends on the way you look at it. If someone has made a suicide attempt, that might elevate their risk. And often people who died of suicide have made prior attempts. Sadly, a certain percentage of people die on their first attempt. But in general, the vast majority of people who make a suicide attempt and survive it go on to live a full life and die of something else later. I hope that answers the question. Thank you. Yeah. So when we talk about a suicide death, we're talking about a death that's caused by self-directed injurious behavior with the intent, and that word is important, the intent to die as a result of the behavior, right? Suicide attempt, a non-fatal, self-directed, potentially injurious behavior with any intent to die, right? Suicide attempt may or may not result in injury. A couple of examples come to mind for me. Let me ask you what you think about this. I mentioned a lot of work in schools. After there's been a suicide death, we were in one school where a big urban area where sadly 3 middle schoolers had died of suicide over a couple of years. And we were doing some suicide prevention education with the school, and they were teaching kids. We were doing some screening, and if kids screened in, if they indicated that they had done, engaged in some suicidal behavior or showed signs of depression, we would meet with them and talk with them. Well, one 8th grader had checked off that she had made an attempt in the preceding year, so I had the opportunity to talk with her. After a little while, I got around to asking her, so what had happened? And she told me that she had taken a pillow and put it over her face in an attempt to kill herself. Well, I know that this is not something it's very unlikely that someone could die from that, right? If they actually weren't getting enough air, they would just pass out and drop the pillow, right? I wasn't going to tell her that. But so let me ask you, was that an attempt? What do you think? Was that an attempt? Any thoughts on that? Someone posted yes. Well, if she thought it was going to cause her to die, then yes. Exactly. And a couple of other people are saying yes. Exactly. Yeah, and I totally agree with you. She thought it could end her life.
So in fact, that was an attempt then. Fortunately, a very low lethality attempt, right? Similar example, we were working with one of the community residences for a community agency that worked with folks with developmental and intellectual disabilities, and they had a person who lived there who had started eating increasing numbers of bananas and was constantly asking for bananas. And eventually someone asked the person why they were eating bananas a lot. And what they told the staff was that they had heard that you could kill yourself by taking an overdose of potassium. And they knew that there was a lot of potassium in bananas. So they were eating bananas in an effort to end their life. Is that a suicide attempt? Well, kinda, huh? In an interesting way, because we have to understand the meaning of it, and the intent is what the issue was there, right? And we all use the term suicidal ideation often, and what that's about is just engaging in thoughts of thinking about suicide, thinking about ending life. There are a number of other things that come up for us oftentimes, which help us understand sort of the severity of a risk and have a sense of what's going on. I'll just share a few of those with you. Some of these, so we've talked about attempts, suicide, ideation. There are some, often we talk about and refer to non-suicidal self-injury. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Anyone have a sense of what's the difference between what we typically call non-suicidal self-injury and suicidal behavior? What's the goal of like cutting and stuff like that?
So the goal of cutting is to distract themselves from the difficult emotions and feelings that they're experiencing, but it's not an intent to kill themselves.
Exactly. It's a different intent, isn't it? Exactly. So suicidal behavior is about ending existence, ending life, ending consciousness. And you're right. The non-suicidal self, and what people often tell us is they get some kind of a relief, a release, right? A release of tension, some distraction. I've heard some people say it helps them feel something, at least, because they can't feel anything. And interestingly, there's some conversation that even on a physiological level, when we're injured like that, our bodies release. I was going to say oxytocin. It's not oxytocin. It's endorphins, which are sort of a natural opioid, right? Which help us feel better and sort of numb some pain. So it's kind of interesting, but totally different behaviors. Now, it is a risk factor for suicide. People who engage in non-suicidal self-injury may be at elevated risk of suicide. Sometimes people will have an attempt that's interrupted. And if that happens, it's interesting to know and helpful to know, did they stop it themselves or was it interrupted by somebody else who happened upon them while they were making an attempt? And what's helpful to know about that is if somebody stops themselves, that really goes towards their ambivalence. And ambivalence is our friend when we're trying to deal with helping prevent suicide. And that lets us know. Sometimes people will start engaging in preparations. They'll start doing a little research online. And goodness knows there's been just an awful article and some podcasts this week in the news about some online websites where people go to talk about this stuff together about how to end their lives. But preparatory behavior could be like collecting pills or testing out different methods or things. So these are all helpful things to know and to hear about to help us get a sense of what level of risk are we thinking about or understanding or seeing. So in the spirit of that, I just want to throw a couple of scenarios by you, some vignettes. These are stories of things that we've actually heard.
Larry, before we go there, a couple of questions from the chat.
Yeah.
The first one from Gwen. Would somebody consider a non-suicidal injury a coping skill?
A coping strategy, absolutely, because people are using those kinds of things often to manage their feeling emotionally dysregulated. Yep. In some way, it helps them feel some regulation. It's working for them is the odd thing, right? We would look at it and say, that's not very good coping. But in some way, it's working for them, or they wouldn't keep doing it, right? Yeah.
And then another question from Sarah, that it seems that the examples you gave of the pillow and the banana includes a means, a plan, and intent. Will you be speaking on how to approach that from a non-clinical perspective or role?
Well, Yeah, yes. And I think the simple answer is that these are the kinds of things that sometimes you'll be hearing from families, or you might hear from someone you're working with, or from a service provider or something. So understanding these things and knowing about it and being able to talk about it, I think with the people you serve, and to be able to elaborate some more, I think is really important and helpful. Yeah, to get a sense of what's going on for somebody.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm acknowledging you're not therapists in your roles, right? That's not your role, but I think we all have a role in suicide prevention, and particularly when we're in human services of any kind, social services. I believe it's really important for us to have some real basic skills and knowledge so that we can get a sense of what's going on. And I'm jumping ahead of myself here too, but I think part of that is making sure that we don't overreact or underreact, but that we don't overreact just because, if 12 million people a year are saying they have thoughts of suicide, and if some 12 million people mention that and we immediately sent them to the hospital, that would just traumatize all those people, but just totally overwhelm our behavioral health system, right? So there's all this sort of gray area, and it's important to have some general understanding of at what point are we seeing elevated risk, and at what point can we help manage it in the community. That kind of answer that?
I think so.
Thanks. Great. All right, let me jump into sharing a couple scenarios, and then I'll ask you just to, based on what you see here, and then look at the list of terms here, just maybe type into the chat, what is it that we're seeing? You could use the letter or the words. And here's the first one. Hopefully the sound will be a little better. Let's see. Actually, let me move this.
I had my heart broken last week. Took 4 clonazepam, called a girlfriend, and I did it on the phone. It wasn't a serious attempt, but I did want to die when I took the pills.
I had my heart broken last week. I took 4 clonazepam and cried it out, talked it out with some of my friends. It wasn't a serious attempt, but I did want to die when I took the pills. What's she describing? And let's give just a few seconds, type in the letter in the chat, and maybe
looks like we have a vote for A, suicidal ideation. Another vote for A. D, non-suicidal. So 2 A's and a D, Larry.
So far. Any others?
Yeah.
Next time we'll set this up as a poll.
There you go. We also have a few more votes for D. One looks like it's split between A and F.
Great. It's hard, isn't it? It's kind of all over. And that's the purpose here, for us to think together about, well, what's going on when we hear or see behaviors like this. Well, she's telling us she took 4 pills, and yeah, she knew it wasn't serious, but she wanted to die when she took them. So that's actually the definition of an attempt, that she had the intent of ending her life when she took them. Yes, she most obviously had suicidal ideation if she was thinking about doing that and doing it. But yeah, I think the answer there is it was an attempt, because she said she wanted to die when she did it. You see where that would be? Let's try another one.
During the pill count on the hospital ward where I work, I discovered that 6 tablets were missing. I asked my patient about it, and she admitted that she was saving them up so she could take them all together at a later time in order to kill herself.
That's Wahida, one of our colleagues at the trauma center, and she is describing that. She said during a pill count on the hospital unit where she was working, they found that one of their clients had basically been collecting pills. That she had collected 6 pills, and when she was asked about it, she said she was saving them up so that she could take them in an attempt to kill herself at a later time. So, what do you think that would be based on these terms?
Lots and lots of votes for F.
For preparatory behavior, exactly.
For preparatory behavior.
Yeah,
yep.
Exactly. She's preparing for something later, which is showing us some elevated level of risk, right? There's suicidal ideation, which we now know lots of people might think about suicide. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to act on it. But if somebody has a plan and then they start acting towards that plan, you see the sort of risk level increasing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Larry, there's also some votes for E, and perhaps this might be a time to explain the difference between an interrupted and attempt or preparatory behavior.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. So, I think they interrupted her planning, right? Her preparations for it. I think when you hear like interrupted attempt, that's more dramatic. Like someone has walked in when somebody is just trying to do something. They found somebody with a gun in their hand and, took it away. They found someone who just took a handful of pills and called for an ambulance. They found someone, I hate, this is disturbing to even think about some of these things, right? They found somebody who was just getting ready to, enact something or had started to enact an attempt, and they've rescued them. I had a friend once who actually, somebody didn't show up at work. He went to the house because they were worried about this guy and found that he was trying to asphyxiate himself with exhaust from a car, and he was rescued. So it's that level of intervention, that interruption of the attempt in progress.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, one more question, Larry. This is such a great conversation from Felicia. So at what point in this type of scenario do you consider the attempt beginning? And Felicia, no need to apologize. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, Felicia. Yeah, please. No bad questions here. At what point? So if someone, I like that question. So if someone's making preparations, they're going out, they're buying sleeping pills or whatever, they're collecting them or whatever, but they haven't actually taken them yet. It's the action itself that would lead to the death would be the attempt, right? So the taking the pills, the actual, someone is just about to step in front of a car, something like that, and they get grabbed or something like that, that would be an interruption. But not the preparations, actually going to the store and buying the pills, for example, that action wouldn't lead to a death. It will eventually, right? As it gets played out. Could potentially. Does that help? I think it's much more the attempt. The beginning of the attempt is really the beginning of the actual action that could lead to that could in the immediacy lead to the death.
I guess my question was, if this is a situation where the only access that she has is sort of has to be spread out over time, because like if she's getting her pills counted, she can only collect them so quickly. So the attempt, I guess my kind of feeling is like if somebody who is in a really restrictive environment, like a lot of the people that we support, and they don't, and it it takes a long time for that preparation to happen in a way that for somebody who has more access and freedom could happen in a more quick way, right? If I can go to my medicine cabinet, take everything that I have, my attempt, everybody would consider the point where I start collecting the pills as the beginning of the attempt, because I go collect the pills and then I take them. But if you don't have enough, and that's part of your process, you're in an ongoing process that hasn't stopped. I guess that's where I wonder how like when you're thinking about supporting somebody and this is sort of the place that they're at, how does that differ in how we're supporting them,
Well, the good news is if there's good news in these things is that if you catch someone earlier on while they're in that preparatory stage, then you're much more likely to be able to help them, right? Than if they've actually enacted the attempt. So you're right, for that person who takes a bottle full of pills, the attempt is when they've actually swallowed the pills, right? Or they're just about to do it, right? Somebody walks in the bathroom and finds them doing that, that could be an interruption. I've had a situation like that where one of my clients' daughter walked in and found her doing that and called. She was taken to the hospital because she had just swallowed all the pills. I hear your point. And in some ways, because of those restrictions, that may be a slight protective factor, that it's harder for some of the folks that you all serve to have access to these lethal means. I mean, depends on the person, depends on the level of support and care and restriction they have, right? So my hope would be that if people are trying some of this preparatory, that they're more likely to be discovered, right? And so we have an opportunity to intervene earlier. So hope that makes sense. Let's, I'm going to, now here's, I'm gonna skip over this one because if this will allow me to. Here.
I was unconscious when they took me to the ER after I took 300 pills. I woke up there and I told them I didn't have any intention of dying.
I woke up, I was in the ER after I took 300 pills. I woke up there and I told 300 prescription pills. I woke up there and I told them I didn't have any intention of dying. Now, what do you think here? This one's a little more challenging.
All over the map.
Yeah.
B, H, D, G.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one's hard. Now, and again, this depends on who this person is and what her background and her understanding is. For most of the adult population, I would typically say, this doesn't pass the "oh, come on" clause. Like, you don't take 300 pills without knowing it could likely kill you. So for many people, that would be a suicide attempt. But you heard me mention earlier that also depends on a few other things. What's a person's cognitive capacity? Do they understand? Do they fully understand what the implications are of taking all those pills? Do they think this is more something that'll just, hurt them and get them a ride to the hospital? So some of this means you have to find out what the motivation, what the intent was when they took them. She's denying intent for someone if this wasn't someone with some intellectual disability or limitations, if this wasn't someone who was who's having like a psychotic episode and her thinking was like all challenged, then that would probably be seen as an attempt. But again, it goes down to really listening, talking, discovering, and figuring out the intent, which makes it hard. And I guess the answer is it depends on this one, right? Yeah. So we've talked a lot about numbers, demographics, trying to understand. Let me ask you, and we've talked about definitions around suicide, but how do we come to think about what is suicide about? If you were to help us put together a definition from the psychological perspective, what's the psychic experience? What's going on for people that they might be thinking of suicide? What's the phenomenology, if you will, if we were to come up with the psychological definition of understanding suicide? What comes to mind for you? And again, please feel free to unmute.
Yeah. Some comments in the chat. Part of it is feeling like you're a burden to everyone around you, feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, escape, no self-worth, avoidance, to stop the pain, no way out.
Amazing. Yes, absolutely. To all of those. Yeah, it is. The best definition we've come across, I think, is it's an attempt to solve the problem of this intense psychological, sometimes physical, pain and hopelessness. And that pain is about all these things that you were just talking about, right? This sense of being a burden. You'll see that's an essential feature of some current theories about suicide. This helplessness and hopelessness, that it's just never going to get better. I can't change anything here, right? And dramatic feelings of decreased self-worth, of not feeling worthy, right? All of those things that are leading to intense psychological pain. And one of the things I like about this definition is where it says it's an attempt to solve a problem, right? Because we're all probably pretty good problem solvers. We're good at helping people solve problems. And that is one way in which we can actually start talking to people. And I think, you asked the question earlier about how does understanding that this is a coping strategy help us talk to people about it? And I think this is the way. I get that what you're trying to do is solve a problem that you've been dealing with. And it sounds maybe maybe you've been dealing with this problem for a long time, and it sounds like you feel like you just really can't do anything about it anymore. But you know what? Here's how I would talk to someone about this is, but I got to tell you, I've talked to a lot of people over the years who've been in binds like you're in, some even worse, believe it or not. And we've always found a way to help deal with the problems. We've always found some way to figure out how to manage and to get through and to find some hope. And you can even say to someone, and I get that right now you might not feel like there's any hope, but let me hold on to that, because I'm quite convinced that we can find some hope and work on this together and work as a team with your team to get you through this stuff. If we understand it as a way of solving a problem, that gives us some language and a way of thinking about it and talking about it with people. That's what the coping strategy is about, right? They're trying to solve these intense angst that they're feeling, this intense. There's somebody back in the field, this guy, Edwin Schneidman, who was one of the founders of the American Association for Suicidology, came up with this term. He coined it. It's called psych ache, like a headache. Well, this is the ache of the psyche, really, the sort of that people are experiencing. And our job is to help ease that, to help them solve that problem. Number of theories that have come up around it, and one of you may well know Thomas Joiner's theory. Thomas Joiner is one of the leading theorists in the US right now on suicide. He is a psychologist and a professor at Florida State University, has a whole program of research that's been going on for a couple of decades now. He has been the co-director of the Department of Defense, the military suicide prevention research consortium, written lots of books, a book called Why People Die of Suicide, Lonely at the Top, a book about men and suicide. He's written a book on murder suicides, pretty fascinating reading if you're into that kind of stuff. His theory is that there are a couple of psychological features that are always present for the people who, his words, who desire, I'm not sure I'd say desire suicide, but who think about suicide. And one was that sense of being a burden to others, right? What does that sound like? In adolescence, that's often, I'm such a screw up and such a mess up, I keep getting suspended or arrested. My family would be better off without me, right? In elders, sometimes we hear that, I used to be able to take care of myself and I earned money and I could drive, and now people have to come take care of me and count out my medicines for me. They'll be better off without me, and I could, see with some of the folks that you serve and work with, that kind of, like, I can't do the things I want to do for myself. This is never going to change. This will never get better. My family has to take care of me. My brothers and sisters are all married and out of the house, and mom and dad just have to take care of me. They'd be better off if I wasn't here anymore. That kind of sense that I'm a burden to others.
I'm so sorry, a question from the chat. Have you ever encountered a scenario where a person is using suicide as a means to punish others for their behavior? On the surface, they would use suicide to punish others, but underneath, the individual is trying to solve a problem. And Gwen, if you'd like to pop on and elaborate some more, by all means.
Gwen, that's a great question. And I think in the past, the field used to think more of it, that sometimes it was someone trying to get back at someone or express anger. That was more some of the earlier, more psychodynamic thinking. I suspect there are some times that happens. I think we may see that with people with some, younger people or people with limited intellectual capacities, again, who don't fully understand what it means. More often than not, though, it usually comes down to these kinds of issues that they're dealing with, the psychological pain. I think in the vast majority of the cases, sometimes there could be that sometimes that anger or that rage that is there is leading to this intense psychological pain, this intense emotional disruption or disequilibrium, if you will. So sometimes intense anger is part of the picture. And there's probably a small number of cases where suicide might be about trying to express anger towards somebody else. As I say, it's not thought of as much that way as it had been in the past. I think that comes from some of the advances in some of these theories, like the sense that it's more about the psychological features, the burdensomeness, the sense I'm disconnected from others. I'm not part of any meaningful social connection, which often when people have died by suicide, and we go into a workplace or a community or an agency or something, and people will say to us, "Oh my God, they were so popular, everybody loved them," but the person's not feeling it. They're not feeling it themselves. But here's the thing. So there are a number of these things that go together that might lead to that intense psychological pain. But Joyner says to us, the psychological pain alone is not enough to get someone to cross what is this kind of instinctual barrier. We come wired from the factory to keep ourselves alive. From an evolutionary perspective, it is really hard to end our own lives, right? We're wired to survive. So to cross that line takes a lot. And what Joyner says is that he believes that there are certain things, features that would lead someone to be capable of crossing that line. We often think of it too as somebody who may have habituated in some ways to things. So what's he talking about? He's talking about people who might have learned through their professions or have they've experienced or they've witnessed a lot of things that could lead them to be more able to cross that line. Some of those experiences might be things like physical or sexual abuse, chronic pain, right? That non-suicidal self-injury where someone's already crossed the line and is injuring their body. It could be things like, well, what would be some, maybe stepping away from some of the people that you serve, thinking in the broader public, what might be some occupations where people may have learned the kinds of skills that might make it easier for them to end their life? Well, let's think about people like our first responders, right? They've witnessed other suicide deaths. They've witnessed death. Our police, our military folks, they know what it takes to end a life, right? And they have access to the means often, right? Physicians certainly know. We've heard that there's increased numbers of suicides and rates among veterinarians, for example. So, people who have the knowledge, the learning, the capability. This could be people who've made prior attempts, right? This is the other side of that coin. If somebody's made an attempt, I mentioned to you 90% of people don't go on to make other attempts, but some people, they've already crossed that line, right? Or people who have witnessed or been exposed to other suicide deaths. So we know that there are increased risks of deaths in families where there's been a suicide death, in schools or agencies or some workplaces where there's been suicide deaths through maybe other, increased numbers of deaths. So Joyner's point is that it's not just the psychological features, it's often someone who then has the exposure in some way to suicide or to the skills and abilities, has the capability or has habituated to ideas of suicide. Now, a couple of them, we're going to take a break in just a moment or two, but a couple of other folks, David Klonsky, Alexa May, who are at the University of British Columbia, have taken Joyner's theory and kind of tried to refine it, move it forward a little bit. And they break it out in this way. They call it the three-step theory of saying if you have psychological pain just by itself, it's probably not going to lead to thoughts of suicide. But if you're in a lot of psychological pain and it feels hopeless that this is just never going to end, that nothing's ever going to change, that is where they say it could lead to thoughts of suicide, right? And then they go to what's one of the big protective factors we know is social connection, being connected to other people, right? But if people have a lot of pain and they don't feel like they have any social connections to help buffer all that psychological pain, then their thoughts of suicide could really increase. And then they go with the questions that Joyner asks: do they have the capability? Do they have the capacity? Do they have the skills, the means, the exposure, the learning that might help them cross that sort of barrier, right? That might lead to an attempt. Thoughts, questions? We've covered a lot of material here so far. Great. Well, here's what I'd like to do. We've covered a lot. Why don't we take a break for a couple of moments, a couple of minutes? Please be sure to stretch, get up. I hope it's as gorgeous out where you are as where it is where I am. Maybe this is the 5 minutes to go stand on the porch or get in the sun for a few minutes. Bio break, whatever you need. So it is 12:31. What if we come back at 2:31? Sorry. What if we come back at, how about 2:44? How's that sound? I'll be back at 2:44.
Sounds great.
Great. So before we jump back in, any thoughts, questions, reactions, agreements, disagreements, anything that's come up for you as we've gone over a lot of this material? Okay. We'll jump back in. Great. So let me pull the slides back up. Looks like I need a second here. I'm going to ask you to bear with me. Again, this is a new platform for me, so let's try this again.
While Larry is getting his slide deck situated, it's amazing what a 15-minute break can do. Perhaps in the chat, are folks finding this helpful, informative, meeting expectations?
We have an awfully quiet group here today, don't we?
Well, actually, I've been loving all the questions and comments earlier. I think we're doing okay.
I think they loaded them up front.
Yeah,
I think
right.
so too.
That's
well,
good.
I am seeing some yeses in the chat, so thank you. Thanks everyone. We do have a good Larry, just maybe kicking us off. A good question from Julianne of wondering if there's more attention now on youth and bullying and social media influence on suicidal ideation.
Yeah, absolutely. We've known for a long time about bullying, and actually, thank you. Your question, this was a setup. I'd asked for that question. Gets right into risk factors, which is where we're going.
You didn't even know. You didn't know.
We know that there's a whole bunch of risk factors, right? And things like bullying, absolutely, is one. And interesting, I'll jump ahead and say that, that falls for me into that category of psychosocial issues. We know that, for young people who are bullied, there's a higher rate of suicidal behaviors than for like kids who aren't bullied. But interestingly, at least one study has said that kids who've been bullied, so kids who are bullied have higher rates of suicide. People who bully have even higher rates of suicidal behaviors. And people who've been bullied and become bullies have even higher rate of suicidal behaviors. So bullying absolutely is in there. Lots of conversation about the roles of social media. If you got till 10 o'clock tonight, I could go off for quite a while on things like 13 Reasons and the kinds of stuff that goes on. We know you've probably seen some of the attention to, Instagram lately and concerns about, depression and anxiety and the impact on body image from social media. All kinds of issues have come up around social media, and there are pros and cons to any new technology. I mean, there's lots of great information out there around suicide prevention online, for example, but then there's a lot of stuff that happens that can be pretty negative on social media too. So yes, there has been a fair amount of attention to that. And we do pay attention to all these different kinds of risk factors. Risk factors for suicide, they don't necessarily tell us who's going to die of suicide, but they let us know who's at elevated risk, right? Kind of like, think about heart disease. What do you know about what are the risk factors for heart disease? There are things like genetics, obesity, lifestyle, smoking, exercise, diet, all those kinds of things. But do they tell you who's going to die of a heart attack or a stroke or when? No. Same thing with risk factors around suicide. They let us know who's at elevated risk, and we assume the more risk factors, the more potential risk. But that can't tell us exactly who's going to die of suicide and when. So things like we know family history, I mentioned that earlier, increases risk. A previous attempt, again, while I said most people don't go on an attempt again, but a previous attempt does mean there's some elevated risk. And if there's 2 or more attempts, then we're talking about a lifetime of elevated risk, right? There are a few medical factors, the demographics, you saw some of that earlier. Age, some races have higher rates. And interestingly, among demographics, I often talk about people who are autistic. There was at least one survey of autistic folks and 2/3 of the people in that survey said that they had thought of suicide at some point. 2/3, that's a lot. And 1/3 of the folks, so about 33% had said that they had actually made a plan or an attempt. Okay. And when you look at the general population, it's only like 2.5% of people have to say they've made an attempt. So significant numbers, right? That also goes to demographics, also goes to things like GLBTQ status, right? Some of the studies have shown us that I think for folks who identify as gay, lesbian, bi, or questioning, there's a 4 times greater likelihood of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. We wouldn't know about actual deaths because that information is not available on death certificates, so we couldn't collect that kind of information after there's been a death. But in terms of interviews, surveys with people, about a 4 times greater likelihood of suicidal thoughts and behaviors as compared to their heterosexual peers. And this will be not a surprise to any of you, if the person with that status orientation is in a highly rejecting family or community that's highly rejecting that status, it's more like 8 times greater likelihood. And I sort of separated out transgender. The numbers are really alarming there, folks. There was a study recently in the Journal of Adolescent Psychiatry that showed that about 51% of transgender adolescent males had said that they had attempted suicide, and significant numbers of other people in surveys who identify as transgender have said that they've made attempts. So that's a community we absolutely have to wrap ourselves around. Cognitive style, and that goes to some of the people that you serve, right, and that you work with. So cognitive style, that's often the folks whose thinking is sort of like all or nothing thinking, right? They get fixated on one way of dealing with something and aren't flexible problem solvers. Those folks, and if we think of suicide as an attempt to solve a problem, and someone's not a flexible problem solver, you can see where that's going to complicate things. People sometimes get fixed on the idea of suicide as a way to solve their problems, and that's pretty dangerous, right? Cognitive style could also relate to things like perfectionism. We've certainly been seeing among a number of younger people recently this sort of internalized perfectionism being a pretty big risk factor, feeling that they just can't measure up, they can't be good enough. The sense of self-worth is so tied up in some kind of performance. Access to means, you heard that early on when we were talking about communities that seem to have higher rates. So we know that having easy access to lethal means can increase risk of suicide. It's one of the few actually evidence-based strategies for decreasing suicide deaths and increasing prevention is making it harder for people to access lethal means. So what does this tell us? Actually, again, jumping ahead to what we do, it's if we're working with someone who we're concerned about in terms of suicidality, that means we need to ask questions. Somebody needs to be asking the question of the family. Is there a weapon in this house? You know, do they have any access to weapons? Making sure, do they have any access to medications? You know, should medications be prescribed in smaller amounts? You know, some of the people you have that you work with and serve are sure living independently, and if those are folks we're concerned about, we want to make sure that you know, maybe prescribers are giving them just a 30-day supply, not a 90-day supply of medications, or they're in bubble packs, which has been found to make it more challenging. It seems to decrease the risk of people using medications for a suicide attempt.
We have a comment from Victor in chat who says that he has an individual who attends a college setting where suicide rates are high, and it's alarming. And Larry, I know from the work that we do with colleges and universities, we're certainly seeing that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And you just kind of skipped right ahead to that exposure to suicide, which is absolutely a risk factor that we worry about. So if we have someone who's in a community like that and they have a bunch of other risk factors, it's something we really want to talk about. And we will be talking at some point too about how do we kind of shift the narrative around suicide once people are exposed to suicide. You're absolutely right. If that becomes sort of a script or a narrative in a community, we're going to worry about it and have to actively think about how do we have conversations about suicide and suicide prevention in those communities. And thank you for mentioning that, Becky. We have been doing a fair amount of work with a few universities in Massachusetts recently, where they're quite concerned about the suicidal behaviors and trying to prevent suicide.
And Larry, this is Victor here. Sorry, I'm just having some difficulties with my video, and it's messing with, it can mess around my audio, so I'm just playing it safe. But yeah, so I just want to, I don't want to get too heavy into it, but when the family approached me around a letter that they had received from the school, that's what initially drew attention to it. I think, my individual also, received a letter. It was the third, attempt, and, the 3 deaths, to say the least. So it opened up the conversation around, just kind of how to have kind of those just conversations around like the reality of it, kind of like what we spoke on earlier. So, I guess it just, the individual has coaching in place, has Easter seals in place, 2 very good services that allow for college navigation, essentially, and life coaching services, both comparable services. But both agencies have done a really good job with being able to help the individual and the family sort of kind of dissect some of those things. So I think it kind of speaks to the work that the providers are doing out there. So I just wanted to draw attention to that, because I can only imagine, I'm not the only service coordinator who has folks, who are in college, and essentially kind of hearing about those things. And I see it's alarming, because it is, he's not the only one where we hear it from, and I think we hear it from, kind of across the board. So I just kind of wanted to add to that. So.
No, absolutely, Victor. You're right on the mark on that. And it's concerning. And kudos to the school for getting information out to people, because what they're saying basically is, we want you to have the facts and we want you to be able to talk about it. Because if they don't do that, then conversation happens and it kind of goes underground, and it's better that it be out there, and we encourage people to talk about it. I'm going to jump ahead here and talk about, so how to even talk about that then. My way of talking about it is to say a couple of things, which is, one is, it's a real tragedy to hear about that. I'm really sad to hear that. And it's really a tragedy that, young people are, ending their lives there at that school. And another tragedy, to my way of thinking, is that person somehow got into a, sort of like a dark place. They felt like they were backed into a corner psychologically. And at that moment, the real tragedy was that they didn't realize they could reach out to somebody, and that nobody should ever have to be struggling alone, and that we should all be able to just connect with other people to get the support we need, and let other people know when we're thinking about those things. So that's a way of changing the narrative a little bit, and sort of giving the message that, the equal tragedy here is that people are struggling and not reaching out for help when there's help available. So I think that's one of the ways of countering that kind of exposure to suicide. We could talk more about that. And you see some of the other factors here too. The usual clinical factors like depression, bipolar disorder, substance use for sure. And interestingly, among the substances, gambling is recently, we're hearing, is one of the has some of the highest rates of a suicidal connection to gambling. Clinical factors, eating disorders have a significant comorbidity with suicide. Any of the sort of more impulsive kinds of things, extremes of impulsivity, ADHD, extremes of ADHD, or sort of explosive disorders. Those seem to have the connections with suicidality. But again, no one of these indicates that someone is going to die of suicide. Again, just to reinforce, because it's such an important issue, that issue about guns and access to guns. This gets to the numbers that we were talking about earlier. If you break out states that have high gun ownership rate and states that have lower gun ownership rate, you can see that this particular study took some that were pretty similar, 39, 40 million, and look at the total number of suicide deaths. Well, the states that have the high gun ownership rates have the higher number, the 14,000 there. But the non-firearm suicide deaths, the numbers are almost the same, right? What accounts for the difference, the big difference there, is the firearm deaths. So it just reinforces that idea that we need to be very mindful of that and making sure somebody, if we're concerned about someone, that someone's asking about any potential access to firearms. Similarly, folks familiar with the ACEs studies, Adverse Childhood Experiences studies, very robust research from out in the West Coast, Kaiser Permanente, and started this in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Some big studies came out. They looked at 17,000 health records. You know, the scale of this research is like, you know, we see it nowhere else, and found that they were looking at 10 early adverse experiences, things like sexual abuse, neglect, physical abuse, a parent in jail, alcoholism, domestic violence in the home, parental divorce. There were 10 of these items. And the more of these items that were in people's lives early on, the more likely they were to die younger than the average, to have autoimmune disorders, ischemic heart disease, develop depression, suicide attempts, and suicide deaths. And it's like very rarely do we see the strength of correlations like this in social service and healthcare kinds of research. Knowing so that the more, and what you're seeing here is, you know, the lighter color attempts during adolescence, childhood, attempts during adulthood, the darker colors, the more of these adverse experiences people had early on, the greater the likelihood of suicidal behaviors. So again, these are just things we're collecting. You know the people that you have who might be at some elevated risk. But how do we put all that together then to understand how a suicidal event could unfold? This sort of, I don't know, call it a flow chart, a chain analysis, if you will, was developed, conceptualized by a colleague of ours, Madeline Gould, who's at she's an epidemiologist at Columbia University. She's done a lot of research on suicide education and prevention, and looking at questions like, is it safe to talk with younger people about suicide? And the answer is yes. It doesn't plant the idea. But Madeline's actually been on our advisory committee. It's just a wonderful, brilliant resource and delightful person. She says if we start with a bunch of these underlying vulnerabilities that we're talking about, right? The depression, the mood disorder, depression, anxiety, maybe there's substance abuse, maybe someone's trying to come to understanding their sexual orientation. We didn't even talk about neurotransmitters like, you know, low serotonin levels or something. You got a bunch of those going on, right? That perfect storm of things that are coming together. And then something happens. This is the tipping point. This is the stress event. This is what the media reports in a way that's dangerous, right? That the person got, you know, arrested and then killed themselves or something. There's some event often, not always, but often that happens that leads to this significant mood change, right? So the anxiety is like crawling out of their skin anxiety. It's dread. It's a sense of hopelessness. This is despair. This is never, ever going to get better. It's not just anger. It's rage, right? It's these giant, extremely uncomfortable emotional experiences. And those are what might drive someone who's had thoughts of suicide to act on those thoughts. So there's some things that might inhibit that. So a strong personal or religious taboo against suicide, having a lot of good supports around, being slowed down means like too drunk, too high, too depressed to actually act on these thoughts. Literally having other people around is protective. But sadly, what could facilitate this is not having much taboo, having easy access to some means of suicide, you know, bridges that don't have barriers on them, a weapon, right? A lot of pills available. You know, sadly, one of the, you know, strategies that people use are, you know, trespassing on train tracks. You know, and there are some preventative kind of features about that, but if people have the easy access is the point to those kinds of things that could facilitate someone who's in that crisis to acting on those. We also know that a fair number of people who are thinking of suicide let us know in some way, right? There's a bunch of studies, and Rebecca, I've got big thanks and kudos to Rebecca, who recently found this, what you call a meta-analysis, a study that pulls together lots of research on the topic, and found a bunch of studies looking at how often, asking the question, how often do people communicate their intent of self-harm, of killing themselves? the average is about 45% of people communicate in some way. And some of the studies went up to 100% of the people who had died by suicide had communicated. Some went really low, but on average, somewhere around 45%. So people often are communicating in some way. The challenge is for us to be aware of it, to be noticing it. Sometimes it's not direct, right? Sometimes it sounds a little coded, like, oh, I wish I was never born. What does that mean, right? Wish I could go to sleep and not wake up. Tell me more. What's that mean? Just some of these other kinds of things.
Larry, a question. I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No, please
from
do.
Susan. Have there been any studies on children followed by DCF and their attempts with suicide?
We do know that kids who are in foster care and protective custody settings have elevated rates of suicide. That's definitely a risk factor. Yeah. I don't know that Massachusetts particularly has, but other studies in general have found that, sadly. Yeah. That juvenile justice systems tend to increase risk. Yeah. So there are a number of warning signs. These are some of them, people talking about it, right? Saying they wish they were dead. They want to die. They wish they could go to bed and never wake up. Intense guilt or shame. That you brought it up earlier, right on the mark. That's feeling like they're a burden to other people, right? The talk about feeling empty, really sad, talking about really being down or depressed, right? And sometimes we see changes in behavior in people who might be thinking about suicide, getting into really risky behaviors, withdrawing significantly from other people, right? Starting to say goodbye, researching things. When, I've worked with some folks who have told me in the past, like they wanted to start writing a will. Well, what's that about? Why? I want to hear more about that. I'm curious. What's going on? What are you thinking? Right? Significant changes in any substance use. Those are some of the kinds of things that we want to be looking at and listening for, right? And similarly, signs of impulsivity. I mentioned earlier that impulsivity is often associated with suicidal behaviors. And this one particular study asked the question of people who had died of suicide, how many of them had a crisis on the day of the death? This particular study, I think, looked at about 1,600 suicide deaths. And as you might even guess, the younger the person was, the greater the likelihood. That blue line was adolescence, right? Greater the likelihood that there was some crisis the day on which they took their life, right? That embarrassing, humiliating breakup in the cafeteria at the high school or something, and then a death happened. Fortunately, I think for many of us, in the general public, as we age, we kind of learn how to tolerate and know the sort of trajectory, if you will, of our own experiences of being upset or distressed. Not always so for some of the people that we work with, though, right? We want to be looking for protective factors too, right? I've been talking lots about risk factors, but let me ask you, when you are thinking about the people you work with, what are the protective factors that you're looking for to see if they have in their lives? The things that help support them, that help them get through. What comes to mind there?
In the chat, I see friends, healthy relationships, having kids, question mark.
Yeah, exactly. Other people, connections, friends, absolutely. Children can be a protective factor. Mm-hmm. Interesting. One study noted that younger children tend to be more of a protective factor for women, older children, more of a protective factor for men.
Huh. I also see family and support staff, therapists, knowing what their resources are, hotlines, friends, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Yeah, great list. And we should be thinking about that as we're thinking about people and trying to get some understanding if we're concerned about risk for folks. Yeah, a lot of things you mentioned, availability of physical and mental health care, less access to means, safe and supportive environments, those connections. Our grandmothers knew this, but there's research that really, really supports that social connection is a protective factor for lots of things. For people who go through traumatic situations, in terms of suicide prevention, that connection to others is a big protective factor in the lives of folks. And even that idea about reasons for living. Maybe the children are a reason for living. If someone's talking to me about suicide, one of the things I'm going to be asking them is, so tell me, what are the reasons you have to stay, right? What are some of the reasons that you're here? Marsha Linehan, who is the founder and person who came up with the whole concept of dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, created a reasons for living inventory, 72 items that she would often go through with people and ask them to check off what are some. It's helpful for us to know, but it's also a good reminder for people to help them focus on some of the protective factors in their own lives. And to that point, it's interesting. Craig Miller tells us, the guy who sadly you couldn't hear much of in the video, he said most people, like all the providers and stuff, are asking him why he wanted to die. He said it was when his brother came to visit him during one hospitalization and said to him, well, what's going to make you want to stay? He said that really turned him around. That changed his thinking. What was it going to take for him to invest in living?
Larry, one more question on this, back to the protective factors. A question in the chat of, are there any correlations between religious beliefs and suicide? I saw you had a bullet on there about moral objections or involvement with social communities and so on.
Yep, great question. So yeah, often spiritual connections are a protective factor, connections to church communities, because of the social cohesion that goes with that and the sense of community that comes from that would be a protective factor. The religious beliefs. Now, Thomas Joyner, who I mentioned earlier, is one of the theorists. Somebody asked him about that, and he said, look, the graveyards are filled with people who said they were religious. The church graveyards are filled with them. It was a quip he made once, but saying by itself that may not be protective enough, but it may be. I will tell you an anecdote of working with a person years ago who I've been working with for many years, who had a lot of chronic thoughts of suicide. And I don't know, one day she was talking about something that just reminded me of this. I said to her, I said, tell me, I'm not even aware what your religious background is. And she said, why? I said, I'm curious. She said, well, I grew up going to the Catholic Church. And I'm thinking, yes, thank you. And I said, so I'm not Catholic. Could you tell me what did you learn about suicide from the church? And she said, oh, that's not fair. I said, no, really, I'd really love to know what you learned about that. And she said, well, she said that it was a sin. And so it was a protective feature. And I was just trying to amplify that a little bit in this person's life as something for her to hold on to, as one of the things that could help her not necessarily act on thoughts and continue to work towards solving her problems in other ways. So long answer to your question. Yes, connections to church can be protected. Now, I think one of the most important things I've ever learned, I think, about protective factors is they're important. We want to make sure people have them in their lives, obviously, for all of us, for the people we're working with. But if someone's in a crisis around suicide, I'm not going to discount the level of risk just because they have a bunch of protective factors. That's going to help in thinking about planning. Can we count on family? Can we count on service providers and other people to really help them get through? But you want to be, if someone's in a crisis, we want to be sure we're really keenly paying attention to the crisis and not diminishing it because of just because of the protective factors. All right. So now you're suicidologists. We've covered a whole bunch of the basics, some theories, some data, some principles around suicide, risk factors, protective factors. Any other thoughts on those things before we move on? Okay. We're coming into this next module. We often think is one of the most important pieces of doing this work, which is really understanding, labeling, understanding, and thinking about how do we manage our reactions to thinking about suicide, to talking with someone about suicide. How do we manage our response when it comes up? There's Ella Wilson wrote in a book, she wrote a memoir that when her therapist found out she had slit her wrist, she fired me over the phone. Nothing gets rid of people like a suicide attempt. We've heard this so often that people feel like if they talk about it with other people, that they're sort of pushed away. And it's the truth. I prior to being at the trauma center, I ran one of our agency's outpatient mental health centers, and it was not uncommon. It happened frequently that we would get people calling us saying that they were looking for a therapist because they had been dealing with some suicidality or suicide attempt and something, and their therapist in private practice said they needed to be in a center, in a clinic that had more staff that could help support them, where there could be a team. The concept is right, but what's the message to the individual? They feel like they're being turfed, like they're too much to handle or something, right? And the truth is, it brings up a lot for us, right? We've heard some therapists say things like they're really frustrated with people because they're just constantly talking about suicide. People, we talk about getting a knot in our stomach, every time we're working with people who might have been talking about suicide. That whole idea they need more intensive services, that maybe I can't deal with this. And not the least of the worries is we don't want to lose anybody, right? But they're more also worried about what is that going to mean? Well, if that happens, will we get sued? Will our agency get sued? There are just so many pieces to this. So we'd like to kind of honor the fact that we're all humans, that we all have reactions to talking about and dealing with suicide. It is tough. And to that end, just want to ask you to think a little bit together with us about your own reactions. So I'm going to ask you to imagine for a moment this situation, right? Jorge is a 25-year-old man you've known and worked with for the past couple of years, someone your agency serves. He works in supported employment, is at TJ Maxx in the community. He recently spoke with his parents with whom he lives. They mentioned that he's been talking about wishing he was dead. They said, he's talked about this kind of stuff for years. He just does that to get attention, his father said. So you make it a point to go visit him during a lunch break, and he tells you this. Well, once again, I tried to kill myself, and once again, I failed. More proof I can screw up anything. When I told my family I wanted to kill myself, they all laughed. I just went to my bedroom and hit myself on my head 12 times, and then I started to feel better. Right now, you know what? That's the only thing that makes me feel better at all. Work's no better. Reminds me of school where I was bullied since I was a kid or a little kid. Every day is just a living hell. I try to be friendly to people at work. No one's friendly back. And, I love helping people. I'd give up my life if someone needed it, but for now, I just feel dead inside. Not going to be much longer before I'm dead on the outside as well. So I'm asking you to imagine that you've just had this conversation. You've just heard this. You're sitting with Jorge. And I'm not going to ask you what you would do for him or what your next step is. Here's the question. How do you feel? Imagining yourself in that moment, in that situation. It's kind of a fill in the blank, if you will. When I imagine having this conversation with Jorge, I feel blank. Anyone willing to share, either in the chat or out loud, what are your reactions to that? How do you feel? How would you feel if you were in that situation?
So in the chat, we see, I feel like I failed him, or anxious. I think I just spoke over somebody.
I think my first reaction would be like, oh, SHIT, and really worried about the whole situation.
Yeah, that's what I call an oh crap moment. Yeah. Yeah. Feeling like that you failed, anxious for sure. Yeah, what else? Thank you for those. Yeah, what else?
I see still in the chat, empathetic, sad. Where do I even begin? Overwhelmed from the start.
Yeah, great. Overwhelmed. Where do I start? Sad. You feel the empathy for him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It brings up a lot, doesn't it? When we imagine ourselves sitting with people, and that's because we're human, right? These are the oh crap moments, and it brings up a lot. And not that we shouldn't have these kinds of feelings. They're real. Let me invite you to listen to one other. Janice, 40-year-old person who's struggled with lots of suicide for many years. Recently, you've helped her to find a new therapist at the local mental health center after her previous therapist moved to a private practice and no longer accepting insurance. You agreed to, Janice asked if you'd come along to the first couple of meetings with the new therapist. And after a little while, the idea of suicide, the question about suicide comes up. And maybe you've shared with the therapist, yeah, this is something that Janice has dealt with for a lot over the years. And here's how the conversation goes. There's a video here. I'm hoping we'll be able to hear a little bit of it. If not, I'll recap it.
I don't think it's a good idea for us to have therapy. This relationship isn't good for you. It's a sense of wasting.
Yeah, so basically she's saying, I don't think it's a good idea to have therapy. This relationship's not going to go anywhere. I don't know what you're going to try to do for me. It's useless anyway. And she starts yelling, why are you trying to keep me alive? So same question. I don't want therapy anymore. This is going nowhere. Why are you even trying to keep me alive? How do you feel when Janice is saying this to you?
I see despair in the chat.
You were feeling despair, the despair that perhaps she feels too, huh? Yeah.
Just the word despair.
Yep.
Sad, another comment, they feel sad and ineffectual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does feel like a real challenge to us. Yeah. Sad, thanks. Yep. Mm-hmm. What else?
Gosh, I think despair covers it, Larry.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, well, what do we do with that? We get these reactions. They're real, right? And that's because this is tough stuff whenever it comes up. And there's often these power and control issues when people start bringing up suicide. We worry, will it be our fault if something goes wrong? For people who've been working with someone for a long time and have been really trying to help and support them, it could feel like a betrayal. Like I put all this effort into you and now you go and make an attempt after all this work we've tried to do. There are issues about, are we now going to have to do something that's acting against the person's desires, like maybe having to bring them to the hospital or something? That's where it gets into the control issues, that we're going to have to do something. If a young person says to us, don't tell my parents I said this, and you need to for their safety, you're going to have to talk about it with someone, right? Just all these really difficult issues, and they could lead us in a couple of directions. One is the possibility that we could if we're not paying careful attention to our emotional reactions, that we could overreact, right, and put too much controls on, just whisk everyone right into the hospital, when in fact they may. I don't want to over or undervalue hospitalization, right, but going to a hospital, being evaluated and having to stay in hospital can be traumatic for people. It's traumatic. Might be necessary if they need to be for safety reasons. We could underreact because we get so overwhelmed sometimes we just feel like we can't deal with it or don't want to deal with it. And you heard me, the example I gave before, sometimes people feel like they're being rejected, like I can't cope with this, we got to get somebody else to deal with it, right? So let me ask you, when you've experienced those kinds of strong reactions in your work, what do you do with that? What do you do with those reactions when you're in the moment or around the times that you're just having those difficult conversations with people? What are some of the strategies you use for managing your own reactions to stuff? Anybody willing to share?
Victor shared having check-ins with his supervisor.
Supervision, fantastic, Victor. Yep, absolutely. Making sure none of us should ever worry alone, right? We should be really running this by other people, making sure we're checking in. In fact, anytime suicide comes up, that's a good thing to run by a colleague or a supervisor. Yep. Thanks for that, Victor. What else? What other things do people do?
I sometimes take a breath and ask people, like, what's going on with, like, try to understand a little more and talk through it with them if I'm sitting with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, breathing's a good thing, right? Yes, it slows us down. Breathing is the only part of the autonomic nervous system we can control, right? And it helps to slow down the other part. It helps slow down our heart rate and our thinking and stuff, right? Just taking a breath. And I love that you're just trying to engage. Let's have more conversation about this, right? Find out more. You're listening more for their story, right? With curiosity. But that helps you slow down and calm down too, doesn't it? Thanks for that. What
Yes.
Yeah. What else?
A comment in the chat from Kim to separate myself, to think more clearly and supportive, and provide support for the individual in the moment. Also check in with my supervisor and or area director, and check in with DMH for any resources that they might have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So checking in with people. You said separate yourself. Please.
One of the things that
Kim, you go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say you were noting the separate myself comment. So I'm a clinician outside of this role, and I used to work in a prison as a clinician. So I just kind of learned to be empathetic, but also just separate myself so my emotions don't get in the way. Just kind of using, kind of like I think Cindy said, like the breathing techniques, and just very calmly approaching it. And I've learned presenting myself calmly to individuals in need helps them calm down and get into a better space. So that's what I meant by that.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. So yeah, just really being clear, like I'm having my reactions, that person's having their reactions, and you're right, I don't have to take those on. Yep. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, just so many different ways that we can deal with this, right? I don't know if any of you have met Barry Walsh. He used to be the director of the Bridge of Central Massachusetts in the Worcester area. The bridge is now called Open Skies, I think, right? He's an international expert on suicide and non-suicidal self-injury. And he talks about when you're sitting with someone who's bringing up a lot for you, just, to work at maintaining, his term, a low-key, dispassionate demeanor. That's sort of, I think it's about that separation, that we're calm, that we're looking calm. And I often think of, have you ever heard the expression duck face? That if you look at a duck above the water, their face looks nice and calm and serene, but under the water, their legs are paddling like anything, right? So that's kind of, our brains might be racing and we're forgetting all, but our job is to present as calm and clearly as possible. This idea about noticing our reactions is really important too. If we can sort of stop and say, take that breath and say to ourselves, what am I feeling right now? I'm feeling really anxious, or this is really getting me. I'm really feeling this person's despair right now. It literally moves where we're thinking about it, where it's being processed in our brains from some of the lower brain areas, like the limbic, the emotional system, and it puts it up in our cortex, in the prefrontal cortex, where we can actually start doing something with it, right? We can think about it and notice it. And being able to, there's a saying in sort of neuropsychology these days that you got to be able to name it to tame it. Name it to tame it. Right? If we can identify and name the emotional experience we're having, we can then deal with it a little bit, right? And you've all talked about not worrying alone, right? It's so important. Making sure we're getting regular supervision, and especially when we're talking with people about suicide, just checking in with others, always, right? Any other thoughts or reactions around that? All right, thanks. All right, so we've talked a lot about understanding suicide, the theories, the demographics, the principles around it, risk and protective factors. We've talked about our own reactions. This next module is asking us to think a little bit about how do we empathize with the person who is thinking about suicide. And there's a video here I'm going to skip with Craig, who's talking some more about his own experiences, about talking with therapists and what it was like. I'll just ask you if you'd be willing to engage in a thought experiment with us for a moment or two. And if this gets uncomfortable for you for any reason, feel free to just, space out for the next 5 minutes or do something else. But the question is, because some people wouldn't feel comfortable putting themselves in this place. But if you could or would imagine that you were in so much pain that you ever thought about ending your life, would you tell anyone? And if you would, who would you tell? How would you go about doing that? And how many times would you even do that? If they were said, oh, don't be so dramatic. No, you're not going to kill yourself. Don't be ridiculous. Would you bring it up with them again? Would you go to somebody else? What? So it's just a way of trying to get in touch with what that experience might be like for someone else. Anyone willing to share if you were in that situation? Do you think you would tell someone? Or if you would, who?
So a comment in the chat while folks are maybe getting ready to share out loud. Somebody did share that if I was serious doing it, I wouldn't tell. We have somebody else who has shared that, speaking from personal experience. They only told one person, and it was after several years of suffering in silence.
Yeah. Sorry it took so long, but yeah. And it sounded like someone was about to unmute. And
yeah, if I were thinking about this and I were to tell somebody, I think that I would tell my partner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that, he's the person that I spend every single day with, and I think that we connect on a certain level where I feel like I could trust him and he would be able to empathize in a way that I don't know if my therapist could, oddly enough.
Mm-hmm. It does sound odd, but I got to tell you, most of the times we ask this question, people say a partner, a family member, parent, sibling. Not so often a therapist. Yeah. Yeah. And what if someone said, oh, come on, don't be ridiculous, and change the subject? What do you think you'd do? Anyone willing to reflect on that?
Hi, this is Victor here. Kind of just going back to what I think it was Sarah who just said, kind of going to your partner. I think for me, like between my partner, my wife, or my mother, and I say that because for me, just speaking from a male perspective, and I don't want to throw gender into this, but for me personally, in my own experience, in my own life, my conversations with males around anything, not necessarily to do with suicide, I'm just talking in general around emotions, it's kind of been just kind of pushed away versus, where I've talked to my mom, I've talked to my wife, and I know what I would need in that scenario. And I feel like if I were in that scenario, that I would be able to reach mom or my wife and be able to know that, okay, I made that outreach. They've given me what I need at that point. And at this point, not to get religious, but it's in God's hands at that point to be able to hope that, they'd be able to talk to me away from that. So for me personally, it just kind of come down to the two real people in my life. And that's my mom and my wife.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it's totally fair game to, call out some kind of stereotypes or generalized issues around gender because they're real. We see them often. Not everybody, of course. But we do see that. We know that men are much less likely to ask for help or support, which is probably is one of the contributing factors to the reason their rates of deaths are higher by suicide, right? So what you're saying is you'd go to people who you would find the people you could trust to listen and talk about this, right? And that makes sense. And to that point, if somebody starts talking to us about it, then we probably should be honored because it's letting us know in some ways that they do trust us, that they feel they can be safe with us and talk with us about it. So thank you for kind of engaging in that experience, but that experiment. But it really gets to how difficult it probably is to talk about this stuff with somebody else, to even bring it up, the courage it might take, right? And the risk and the worry that will these people take me seriously, right? We've sometimes heard mental health professionals say, when people are talking about suicide, they're trying to manipulate us or something. That's very rare, and there's not much evidence to say that suicidal behavior is about manipulating people. The only time I've actually encountered that, when I said that once, there's not much in the training. A couple of times I did a couple of trainings for mental health professionals on a couple of Navy bases, and they said, in the military sometimes people are trying to get out and they might use that to manipulate it. That's one of the few times I've actually really heard about that, or some people might threaten it or something to try to engage someone in a relationship or something, but it's, to frighten people, to make someone sorry or something. That's not what we typically hear from the people who are thinking about suicide, right? They're talking about getting relief from this awful state of mind, the psychological pain, right? That's part of the definition. To escape from what they feel is an impossible situation that they often feel there's just no way out of, right? So we've got these different goals, right? It's service, often clinicians, social workers, people, that we're talking about keeping the kids we work with safe, keeping the adults we work with, figuring out, how do we prevent a death? But to the suicidal person, for them, it's all about how do I get out of the suffering? How do I escape this emotional distress, right? And because we're often going in different directions, people often won't talk to providers, right? Y'all, none of you said I would pick up the phone and call a therapist, right? We ask young people sometimes, adolescents, like, why wouldn't you tell the adults around you? And they say, well, because the adults all overreact. And you know what? We often do, right? The ambulance gets called and some people get rushed off someplace. People are worried that they'll be seen as weak, going to the guys. Traditionally, they're worried they'll be seen as weak, that they can't take care of themselves. They'll be seen as crazy or something. These are the words that people use, right? So often people say, I'll just keep this to myself. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that discrepancy? Well, again, it's to come back to that point that we started the day with, really, that it's a coping strategy for them. To them, it makes sense. It works for them. You heard Craig say, well, you didn't hear him, but Craig was saying he knew if things got bad, he always had now, right? So in some ways, it's really functional for them. Part of our job is to acknowledge that, not to encourage it, but to acknowledge that we get it, right? And that, when we're talking with someone who's thinking about suicide, everybody's got their own story that leads them to that. And it's probably a pretty profound story. So our job often is to listen. And if we're not the right one to listen, then to make sure they get to someone who really knows how to listen, and doesn't necessarily jump right in, as you heard Craig talking about, with the, how do I fix this strategy? Yeah, we're going to have to get there to helping people for sure. But often what people just want is to be heard, right? And that's really what comes down to the whole, the general clinical approach these days is something it's called the ASHI approach. Group of clinicians who were attending the annual American Association of Suicidology conference, which used to be very research heavy, not as much these days. But they were wanting a place that they could go together to talk about. So what are the real clinical issues if we're going to be working with people who are thinking about suicide? And they went off to Esche, Switzerland, in the Swiss Alps to have a conference, which actually is now held in Colorado annually, this conference, but to talk about just this. And then one thing, what the real takeaway from those meetings has been that the basic message for any of us who are talking with people and dealing with people who are thinking about suicide is to really develop this empathy for that suicidal wish, to show that we get it, we understand, and to learn what about it, why, how in what way might that be helpful to you? Tell me about it. And what other things have you thought about? What other things have you tried? And then let's figure this out together. It's really about coming together and collaborating with a person who's thinking about suicide. And that's got to be the approach, that we're in this together, and literally alongside you. Let's do what we can to figure this out, because I'm convinced there are going to be ways other than suicide. I get that you're thinking of it. I hear that in some ways it helps you feel calmer to know that it's an option. But there are too many downsides to it. I've even said to people who talk to me about suicide that I've talked to a lot of people who've survived attempts or have survived years of thinking about suicide, and their lives have changed in many ways, in ways that they would have never anticipated. So I've seen people who have found spouses who've gone on and gotten jobs, who finished that college education that they weren't sure they ever could. And they're saying that, maybe they still think about suicide now, but that no, they're not going to do that. because they've seen that their life, and I'll often say this to people, I've seen so many times that it's hard, but people who've worked through this say they've been able to make, have a life that's worth living, that's meaningful. Thoughts, questions, reactions to some of that? The point is about the empathy, right? Y'all have a lot of that, you wouldn't be doing the work you're doing. The last module we're going to focus on for today is, so if I'm concerned, if somebody's giving off hints, if they've mentioned suicide, how do we ask about it? How do we get the conversation out there? Now, first thing I want to start with is that, there is a myth out there that if we ask about suicide, that we're going to plant the idea. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Just anecdotally, but we know, and through research, we know that talking about suicide doesn't increase the risk of suicide. Now, I mentioned exposure to suicide might increase risk, right? People who are in places where they've seen other people they might identify with in particular, in some way, maybe someone who's got the same kinds of struggles or something, that exposure to suicide increases risk, but talking about it does not. At its simplest level, let's imagine you say to somebody, I'm concerned about some of the stuff you've been talking about. And I got to ask you, based on what you've been saying, have you thought about ending your life? If they've never thought about that, they're not going to say, now there's an idea. You almost always people say, well, yes. And it's a relief that somebody's finally asked them. They've been holding on to, thank you for the person who shared this, experience. They've been holding on to that thought for a long, long time, and finally get a chance to talk about it, right? So asking about it does not increase risk. If anything, people feel helped and better to have the opportunity to talk about it. So when are we assessing? Well, clinicians are assessing first when they meet them. I assume that's, and you folks can tell me, is that part of your initial intake and assessment? I assume it is. If the topic comes up, we want to check in about it and ask about it. If there are changes going on, let's say, you're working with someone who has been talking with their therapist about thoughts of suicide, or they occasionally talk with you about it, and you're about to take a vacation. You're a big supporter for that person. You're about to go away for the next couple of weeks. Wouldn't that be nice? And that would be a time to check in with somebody that you've been talking with, to say, look, I'm going away. I know sometimes, for people that's sometimes challenging. If, hey, I have been one of your sports. I'm going away for a couple of weeks. I will absolutely be back, but just want to check in with you. How's that going for you in terms of your thoughts of suicide? Transitions.
Larry, there's a question that came in that I just want to make sure you had a chance to answer.
Thank you.
And it's that I've heard that people who have decided they were going to attempt a suicide tend to get happier before they go through with it, which can make providers feel like they are doing better. Is this true?
So anecdotally, we hear that a lot. Many, many times I've heard, and people tell us they've heard, that someone seemed to be doing better. They see that someone who was really depressed or someone who had been suicidal seems to have been doing better for some period of time. And then sort of out of the blue, all of a sudden, it seems like they've made an attempt or they've died by suicide. I've never seen any research on this, but we hear this frequently. So I think the takeaway is, don't let down your guard if you've been working with someone who's really been struggling. But to check in, I can think of a couple of people that I've worked with over the years who've had ongoing thoughts of suicide, and one of them will occasionally say to me things like, "Oh, things are going well for me now. I'm thinking of taking a vacation, so I won't be around for the next couple of weeks." And I know by now to say to this person, let me just check in with you. Sometimes when you've said things like that, it's really because you've been thinking more about suicide lately. Or it could mean checking in and saying, "I'm glad to see that it seems like you've been feeling a lot better lately, and that's really nice. Tell me about that. And what about the thoughts of suicide? They've been there. If they popped in again, is that something you'd be ready and willing to talk about? Just not leaving it on the table, basically, but making sure you don't want to harp on it. And if they're telling you, no, look, really, I'm feeling better. Good. but we need to make sure that we don't totally let our guard down. But again, I haven't seen, I don't know, Rebecca, have you seen any research on that?
I haven't seen any research on that. It's something that we do hear, I think, anecdotally, and something that we know that is sort of related is that often when people are at their lowest, somebody who's experiencing suicidal ideation may feel like they don't even have enough energy to kind of move forward into action, and that sometimes when somebody begins, I know we'll cover medication next week, you know, but can kind of be, or get into a program, kind of start to feel a little better. In the spring, even we'll see an uptick sometimes in suicidal actions, in the acting on that ideation, when somebody feels like they kind of have enough energy. So I think it's sort of a related conversation. But I think what it always circles back to for us clinically, and again, this isn't a clinical presentation, but sort of where you're coming from, is just close monitoring. That if we know that somebody has experienced suicidal ideation, we don't want to let our guard down. We want to keep that conversation on the table, and try to keep an open forum for assessment.
Yeah, that sounds so good and so important. I have my own sort of idiosyncratic take on some of that when people have been feeling better and then all of a sudden, and it seems like a surprise. But I've wondered about this sometimes, again, no research on this, if maybe somebody was doing better and then all of a sudden one day they just start feeling overwhelmed again, and they wake up and they're feeling incredibly depressed, or some huge, you know, emotional experience happens to them, and then the feeling is like, oh crap, I can't keep doing this. You know, I thought I was better. You know, so this is an area I would love to explore somehow someday, but good question. So if we are concerned, how do we ask? How do we ask the question? Well, there's some kind of indirect ways that some people might start feeling more comfortable with. You know, based on what you've said, I'm curious that, have you ever wished you'd go to sleep and not wake up? You know, do you ever wish you were dead? Do you ever wish you weren't born? Those kinds of, you know, if somebody's giving off some kind of comments, some vibes, you're concerned, your spidey sense is picking up on something that, you know, you're worried. There are a number of ways we can ask indirectly, which are fine and can get conversation going. But we always, if we're concerned, we always have to ask directly. You know, have you thought about killing yourself? Have you had thoughts about suicide? We need to practice using the S word and really making sure we're asking directly. Now, to a question that came up earlier, are there any things not to do? Well, here's one way not to ask the question. There are not too many wrong ways to do this, right? But here's one. You're not thinking about killing yourself, are you? Why might that not be a good question to ask? What's wrong with that question? And please feel free to unmute. What's
It almost feels like just like not normalizing it. It doesn't even sound right almost when you say it. You know, so I think if you're putting it in such like a light context, you know, I think we're, you know, we're professionals, but at sometimes, you know, you don't realize it. Sometimes it might come across, you know, but I think in terms of how you're presenting it, you know, it just comes down to
what's about the only answer to that question? You're not thinking about killing yourself, are you?
Right. That's what we're seeing in the chat, Larry, is that it's basically you're setting up a no answer. There's no, the only right answer is no. You're not giving them an opportunity to say
exactly. Yes. It's kind of, you know, it's funny. We one of our colleagues, Jim, did a training in one community with a bunch of the coaches for the athletic teams in the community athletic teams, and we were doing this training. He put this slide up and said, "What's wrong with it?" And they all started laughing. And he said, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I would say," because it just makes you so uncomfortable. You're like, you don't want to hear it. It's kind of what that message is, right? So and there's another question that I'm not saying this is a wrong question. I used to ask this one a lot. And sometimes I just habitually ask the question again. But if I do ask this, I make sure I go further and ask it more directly. What might be the problem with a question like, have you thought about hurting yourself? Thoughts about that?
So, I would think that if somebody wanted to kill themselves, it doesn't necessarily have to hurt. So if they were to hear the word hurting, they might take that very literally.
Yep. Yep. Totally on the mark. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Right. The goal of suicide is to escape pain, right? So they don't want hurt. They don't want pain. Exactly. It could also be a vague question. They might not understand what you're asking. Like, are you talking about like cutting or self-injury or something? But yeah, you're right. Most people who are thinking about suicide would want to find a way that doesn't hurt, right? So exactly. So that is a question to, if you use that one, to make sure you follow it up with a more direct kind of question. And sometimes people are going to say no, right? Any thoughts about why would someone deny? If you ask, why would someone say, no, I'm not thinking of killing myself, don't worry? Why would someone deny? Well, we talked about some of this before, right? Worries.
They don't want to go to the hospital.
Yep, that's one of them for sure. They're worried they won't go, that you're going to make them go to the hospital. Yep.
From the chat, avoiding intervention, avoid disappointing, hurting, or worrying you.
Exactly. Yep. Worrying about disappointing. I've heard any number of young people say they wouldn't tell their parents because they wouldn't want to upset their parents, as if them killing themselves wouldn't upset their parents. But the thinking isn't quite right, but that they don't go beyond that thinking, right? Yeah, worried about the stigma of talking about it, that you'll think I'm weak, that you'll think I'm crazy. Exactly.
Larry, a question from the chat on this subject. Would there be an issue with the statement, you're thinking about killing yourself, aren't you? Is that an appropriate way to say it, or how would somebody respond to that?
I think you're anticipating somewhere we're absolutely going when we come back the next time. We're just building towards that. And there's a whole set of strategies about ways to ask questions that help you get better information. And to have one we call a gentle assumption, and that one's not so gentle, but it's the same kind of process of sort of saying, look, I get it. I'm going to guess you've been thinking about suicide, haven't you? If you do it, I think you have to make sure you're saying it in as supportive way as possible and as empathic a way as possible. And we'll show you some examples of that. But I think you're absolutely on to the idea of presenting things in ways that help give the person permission to talk about it, right? So these are some of the things we were just talking about why they wouldn't. There's a number of ways in which we would potentially ask the question. We're going to get into those the next time, but if it comes up, there's a number of things in general. These are the kinds of questions clinicians always should be asking. In our roles, in your roles, sometimes it's going to come up too. If someone starts talking about, you've gotten a hint that they've been thinking about suicide, we want to ask about it. We want to understand it a little bit so you know what to do next, right? So we want to find out, have they thought about suicide? Have they got a plan in mind? Have they actually thought about how they would do it, right? And do they have the means to do it? Is it, is the means they have bananas, or is the means they have, they're talking about, well, there's a bridge a half mile away, I'd probably go there. Very different, right? Do they understand the consequences of what they're talking about, right? So we want to make sure we're asking about their intent. Are they planning? And actually, around intent, I'll often ask a scaling question if we've gotten into a conversation about, and they're saying, "Yeah, I've been thinking about it," I say, "Well, let me check in with you. Like, how seriously are you thinking about it? Like on a scale of 1 to 10 or something, where 10 is I'd do this today if I could, to 1 being like, no, this is never going to happen. Where would you say you fall?" That's helpful because it gives me an idea of where the person is. It's something we can check in on next week, the week after, the next time we meet or something, and where are they, and kind of relative to it. But we want to find out about those things. Have they actually done anything? Sure, this is child adolescent or adult, anyone that we're working with. Have they actually done anything? Have they started preparing for things? Have you done anything? You say you've thought about how to do it. Have you actually done anything about that? Have you checked it out in any way? I wouldn't give any specifics in asking that, but try to get a sense of if they have. And the next time we get together, we're actually going to start talking about some of these validity techniques, which are some strategies for trying to get information from people. So before we wrap up for the day, I do want to ask, actually, if you would be willing to engage in just some reflection. We spent a lot of time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the engagement. But in the spirit of adult learning, I don't know about you, but often I go to trainings and I hear lots of stuff. I'm thinking, that's interesting. And then you get right back into your emails and your other stuff, and stuff's gone pretty quickly. Has anything popped up today for you that was new for you? Was interesting? Surprised you? Maybe it confirmed something you already knew, but it was good to have that validated. Anything that you want to be sure you hold on to? In answering this question, it helps you remember it. It's also helping the other folks here in hearing it repeated. So anyone willing to share something that kind of stands out for you?
Oh, now we're all quiet.
Well, if you're not wanting to share, hopefully you'll jot something down for yourself that it's a coping mechanism. Yeah, thank you, Cynthia.
Reese, come lay down.
Oops.
No.
Okay.
I think, Larry, Sarah, it might be raising her hand.
Oh, great. Sarah, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to say thank you. I do appreciate this presentation. So I just like him, I also have a clinical background. I was a therapist before I took this position as an ASD service coordinator. I really appreciate being able to go through this again because I don't practice anymore, and to know that my colleagues will also have the knowledge that I have had the privilege to go through in my schooling. It's much appreciated, and the working with the population that we work with, adults with autism, it is unique. I don't know where I was going with this, but I do appreciate the presentation, and I found it refreshing, I suppose.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that feedback. Yeah. Appreciate that. Yeah, and right, you're right. This isn't necessarily, you're not doing a clinical intervention, but these are all the kinds of things we need to know because this stuff comes up, right? It comes up in our work. And we don't want to give the message like, oops, sorry, that's not my department. Let's get you off to somebody else to talk about that. If it comes up, the person's telling you this because they trust you, right? So you want to be able to respond. And fortunately, you came with some of those skills, Sarah. Great to hear. Calm approach, protective factors.
Yeah. I'm forgetting that you can probably see the chat now.
Now I can.
Larry.
Yeah. Now I can.
Yeah, it's important to talk about these things with everyone, even though it might be uncomfortable. This is kind from Mary Kate. Her takeaway today is that she'd want to mirror your calm approach and not be afraid to address it. And following up on that, increasing comfort levels to have a conversation with someone despite not having a clinical background.
Mm-hmm. It has taken some time to feel calm in talking about this stuff. And there's still those oh crap moments for sure, right? But you know what? I've gotten to a point, I want to share a story with you. I've gotten to a point where, I feel like anytime topic of suicide comes up in conversations, no matter where we are, it's kind of like CPR. If you know this stuff, you got to be prepared to use it, right? And I often tell this story about how our younger daughter was a freshman in college. We were going to visit her for parents' weekend, right? Got stuck in traffic. We had dinner reservations. So we called her and said, hey, we're going to be a little late. You might need to be prepared to just come jump in the car when we get there. And she says to us, oh, a couple of my friends are here in the dorm. Their parents didn't come. Can they join us for dinner? Great. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So we get there. The kids are all waiting at the curb outside the dorm. Hop out of the car, say hi to everyone. And here's what I see in here. One of her friends is on his phone saying to someone, Yeah, no, my parents didn't come to visit me for Parents Weekend. I'm going out with Maggie's parents for dinner. And yeah, I guess my parents don't love me. I guess I'll just kill myself. So my daughter looks at me like with this look of horror on her face. And my wife turns to me and says, "You're not going to, are you?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I am." And yeah, get to meet this guy, shake hands, glad to meet you. I said, "Hey, let me tell you what I do for a living." And I kind of explained what I do. I said, "I couldn't help but just overhear what you said to your friend. I just need to check in with you." He said, "Oh my God, no, I'm just being dramatic." I said, "Okay, but I just wanted to let you know when I hear stuff like that, I take it seriously and check in with people." And yeah, and then we went on with the evening. But yeah, I know a lot of young people say stuff like that, right? A lot of older people do too. But my point is, we're all gatekeepers. We're all the people who are hearing and have our eyes on people, and no matter where we are, whether we're in our professional roles or we're in our communities or if we're with our families, when stuff sets off those uncomfortable feelings, or someone said something, we need to respond. So thank you. A long time. I really appreciate all the engagement, and we will look forward to seeing you next week. Glad to stick around for another couple of minutes if anyone had any particular questions.
Yes, thank you so